Hey there, you tired little potatoes. It is indeed that time to bring that calm little sleep ritual back. So let's snuggle up with a wonderful story here tonight, where we step back through the centuries to explore one of England's most beloved traditions, the ritual of tea. From misty mornings in Tudor kitchens to candlelit evenings in Victorian parlours, you'll discover how a simple leaf transformed into a ceremony of comfort, connection, and quiet joy that still shapes British life today. So if you are new to the channel, or more importantly returning, liking the video and commenting significantly helps us out. Also, please let me know where you are listening in from and what time it is for you. Now get to that sleepy spot, turn on a fan for some white noise and let's start. You wake in darkness, though dawn isn't far off. The year is 1720, and you're in a modest house on the outskirts of London, where the city's smoke hasn't yet reached the countryside proper. Your bedroom is cold. Winter never truly leaves these stone walls, but you know that downstairs someone has already been awake for an hour, building the fire that will warm the kitchen and heat the first kettle of the day. The concept of morning tea is still relatively new to English households. Your grandmother never drank it. She woke to small beer or watered wine, the same breakfast beverages that had sustained English people for centuries. But you've developed a taste for this strange leaf that arrived from China, and now your mornings feel incomplete without it. You pull on your dressing gown and make your way downstairs, where the kitchen glows with firelight. The kettle sits on its iron hook, steam beginning to curl from its spout. You've learned that timing matters. Too soon, and the water hasn't reached the temperature needed to properly open the leaves. Too late, and it boils too vigorously, making the tea taste sharp and unpleasant. The tea itself lives in a locked wooden caddy on the shelf. This might seem excessive to future generations, but tea costs more than most people earn in a week. Some households keep it locked away as carefully as they guard their silver. You measure out a careful spoonful of black leaves, their twisted shapes reminding you of tiny scrolls of parchment. When you lift them close, they smell faintly of smoke and earth, and something else you can't quite name. Perhaps the scent of distance itself, of mountains you'll never see. The ritual of brewing is simple but requires attention. You warm the pot first, swirling hot water inside to heat the ceramic before discarding it. Then the leaves go in, and the water pours over them with a sound like gentle rain on stone. Some people insist on exactly 3 minutes of steeping. Others claim 5 is necessary. You've settled on 4, which seems to extract the flavour without the bitterness that makes your mouth pucker. While you wait, you prepare the accompaniments. Sugar comes in a hard cone that requires cutting with special nippers, and you chip off a small piece to dissolve in your cup. Milk is more controversial. Some insist it should go in first to prevent the hot tea from cracking delicate porcelain. Others claim this ruins the flavour, that milk should be added only after tasting the tea's strength. You've noticed that people defend their chosen method with surprising passion, as if the order of milk and tea reveals something essential about character. The first sip is always the best. The warmth spreads through your chest, pushing back the morning chill. The flavour is complex, slightly astringent, faintly sweet, with undertones that change depending on the particular batch. Sometimes you detect notes of honey or smoke. Other times it tastes of nothing so much as the colour brown, rich and deep and somehow comforting. Morning tea serves a practical purpose. It sharpens your mind for the day ahead and clears the fog of sleep. But it's also become a moment of peace before the household fully wakes, before the demands of the day begin in earnest. You sit by the kitchen fire, cradling the warm cup, watching the sky lighten beyond the window. Outside, a bird begins its morning song, and you think how strange it is that such small rituals, hot water, dried leaves, a few minutes of quiet, can make the difference between a day that feels manageable and one that feels overwhelming from the start. Your morning cup rarely lasts long. There's too much to do, too many responsibilities waiting. But in these few minutes, you exist in a pocket of calm, a small ceremony that marks the boundary between night and day, sleep and waking, and the private self and the public one you'll present to the world. To understand how tea became essential to English life, you need to travel back further, to a time when England had never heard of such a beverage. Picture yourself in 1650, in a London that would seem both familiar and alien to modern eyes. The city is smaller, dirtier, and far more dangerous than you imagine. The Great Fire hasn't happened yet, so the streets are still a maze of medieval timber buildings leaning over narrow lanes. Coffee has just arrived in England, brought by traders returning from Ottoman territories. The first coffee house opened 2 years ago, and already these establishments are changing the social fabric of the city. Men gather to discuss politics, business and philosophy while sipping the bitter black drink. But tea hasn't appeared yet. Another 8 years will pass before anyone in England tastes it. When tea finally arrives, it comes through the same trade routes as porcelain, silk and spices. The long maritime journey from China to Europe. The Dutch East India Company brings the first shipments, and for several years tea remains a Dutch specialty, available only in Amsterdam. English traders watch this new market with interest, recognising profit when they see it. The earliest English tea is green, not black. It comes compressed into bricks or twisted into small pellets, and the instructions for preparation are vague at best. Some people boil the leaves like vegetables, others steep them in spirits rather than water. A few enterprising souls even try eating the leaves directly, spreading them on bread with butter. These experiments taste terrible, and it takes time for the proper brewing method to become common knowledge. Initially, tea is marketed as medicine rather than refreshment. Advertisements claim it cures headaches, drowsiness, and something mysteriously called the vapours. One enthusiastic merchant insists it makes the body active and lusty. The medical establishment remains sceptical, but this doesn't prevent curious Londoners from trying it. Catherine of Braganza deserves credit for making tea fashionable. When she marries Charles II in 1662, she brings Portuguese tea-drinking habits to the English court. The new queen requests tea at public occasions, and suddenly, everyone who matters wants to drink what royalty drinks. Fashion has always been a powerful force, and tea rides the wave of royal approval from exotic curiosity to status symbol. The price remains astronomical. A pound of tea costs more than most working people earn in a month, which means only the wealthy can afford to drink it regularly. This exclusivity adds to its appeal. Tea becomes a way to display prosperity, and the implements surrounding it, the pots, cups and caddies, grow increasingly elaborate and expensive. As demand increases, the East India Company takes over the trade, establishing direct routes to China and eventually India. Ships designed specifically for the tea trade begin making the dangerous journey around the Cape of Good Hope, carrying tons of dried leaves in their holds. The voyage takes months, and many ships are lost to storms, pirates, or simply the vastness of the ocean. Each successful arrival drives the market, and gradually the price begins to drop. By 1700, tea drinking had spread beyond the aristocracy to the growing middle class. Merchants, lawyers, and successful tradespeople can afford the occasional pound, and tea gardens open in London where respectable citizens can pay an entrance fee to walk in pleasant surroundings while drinking tea served at outdoor tables. These gardens become popular meeting places, especially for women, who have few other public venues where they can gather without impropriety. The government quickly recognises a revenue opportunity. Tea taxes are introduced, then increased again. By the mid-17th century, the tax on tea is so high that smuggling becomes rampant. Ships land on quiet beaches at night, and contraband tea makes its way inland along secret routes, hidden in everything from coffins to milk churns. Nearly half the tea consumed in England arrives through illegal channels, and everyone knows it, though polite society pretends otherwise. Despite the cost and the taxes and the illegal trade, tea continues its steady conquest of English habits. It's not just a drink anymore, it's becoming woven into the fabric of daily life, marking moments both ordinary and significant. People are beginning to discover that tea adapts to any occasion. Morning alertness, afternoon society, and evening comfort. The ritual is flexible enough to fit anywhere, yet structured enough to feel meaningful. You can see the change in the architecture of houses being built in this era. New homes include rooms specifically designed for tea drinking, with large windows to let in afternoon light, and built-in cupboards for storing the precious leaves and expensive porcelain. The beverage is literally reshaping the English home. By 1780, you've been drinking tea for most of your life, but you're still learning its subtleties. The art of proper brewing has developed into something approaching ritual, with rules and preferences passed down through families like precious recipes. Water quality matters more than most people realise. Hard water, heavy with minerals, makes tea taste flat and dull. Soft water brings out the leaves' complexity, revealing flavours that hard water simply masks. In your household, you've learned which local wells produce the best water for tea. Some neighbours actually transport water from specific springs, believing this makes all the difference. The temperature of the water is equally crucial, though measuring it precisely is impossible without modern thermometers. You've learned to judge by observation. When the first small bubbles appear at the bottom of the kettle, the water is too cool. When it's in a rolling boil with large bubbles breaking the surface, it's too hot. The perfect moment comes just as the water begins to shudder, just before the full boil begins. This timing requires attention and practice, but the results justify the effort. Different teas demand different treatments. Green tea, less common now than it was in your grandmother's time, needs cooler water and shorter steeping. Black tea, which has become the English preference, can withstand hotter water and longer brewing. Some of the new blended teas mixed by merchants to create consistent flavours come with specific instructions that seem to change with each shipment. The teapot itself influences the final result. Porcelain pots are beautiful but fragile and expensive. Earthenware pots are sturdy but can retain flavours from previous brewings, which some people consider advantageous and others find unacceptable. Silver pots are fashionable in wealthy households, though they conduct heat so efficiently that the tea grows cold quickly unless you keep it near the fire. You've developed personal techniques over the years. You never use the same pot for different types of tea, believing each pot should be seasoned with a single variety. You warm not just the pot but also the cups, because cold porcelain lowers the tea's temperature too quickly. You've learned that the first cup poured is weaker than the second, so you pour a small amount, return it to the pot, then pour all the cups at once to ensure equal strength. The question of additives sparks endless debate. Purists insist tea should be drunk plain, without milk or sugar, to appreciate its natural flavour. Pragmatists point out that much of the tea available in England is fairly harsh and benefits from softening. Regional preferences are emerging. People in the north seem to prefer their tea stronger and darker than southerners, though everyone claims their way is the only correct method. Milk quality varies dramatically depending on the season. Summer milk, rich from cows grazing on lush grass, creates a different flavour than winter milk from hay-fed animals. Some households keep a special dairy arrangement with local farms, requesting milk from specific cows believed to produce the best tea accompaniment. Sugar remains expensive enough that its use signals prosperity. The amount you add is carefully calibrated. Too little suggests poverty or stinginess, and too much seems vulgar and wasteful. 1 lump is genteel, 2 is generous, and 3 is extravagant. You've noticed that the quantity people use often correlates exactly with their income, as if they're advertising their financial status with each spoonful. Timing the drinking matters as much as timing the brewing. Tea should be consumed hot but not scalding, at a temperature that allows you to taste the full range of flavours without burning your tongue. This creates a narrow window. The tea must be brewed, poured, prepared with milk and sugar if desired, and then drunk within a few minutes before it cools too much. This urgency is part of the ritual's appeal. Tea demands attention. It can't be ignored or left waiting while you attend to other tasks. The leaves themselves tell stories if you know how to read them. Quality leaves are whole or broken into large pieces, never powdered or dusty. The colour should be consistent throughout without too many stems or twigs mixed in. Fresh tea has a subtle sheen, while old tea looks dull and lifeless. When you open a new caddy, the scent should be immediately apparent. If you have to search for the aroma, the tea is likely past its prime. Storage has become a minor science. Tea absorbs odours from its surroundings with alarming efficiency, so it must be kept away from spices, coffee, or anything with a strong smell. The caddy should be airtight, and many people wrap the tea in paper within the caddy for additional protection. Some swear by keeping a small piece of charcoal in the caddy to absorb moisture and preserve freshness. You've learned to judge the strength by colour, watching the liquid darken from pale amber to deep reddish brown. The perfect shade varies by preference and occasion. Lighter for afternoon social drinking, darker for morning energy or evening comfort. This visual assessment becomes second nature over time, as automatic as knowing when bread is properly baked or a sauce has reached the right consistency. The china itself has become almost as important as the tea it holds. You remember when your mother received her first full tea set, a wedding gift that the family guarded like treasure. The cups were so thin you could see light through them, decorated with intricate blue and white patterns that seemed impossibly delicate. That set still exists, carefully preserved for special occasions, each piece handled with reverence. English porcelain production began because of tea. For decades, all fine china came from China itself, carried in ship holds wrapped in silk and straw for the months-long journey. Many pieces arrived broken, which only increased the value of those that survived. The prices were staggering. A single teacup could cost as much as a working man's annual wage. Then English potters began experimenting, trying to recreate the formula that made Chinese porcelain so uniquely translucent and strong. The efforts produced some interesting failures, beautiful ceramics that were nonetheless too thick, too porous, or too fragile to be truly useful. But gradually, through trial and error and probably some industrial espionage, English manufacturers cracked the secret. Now, by 1790, England produces its own porcelain, and the industry has transformed the landscape of places like Staffordshire. Entire towns exist to serve the tea trade, with hundreds of workers painting delicate designs on cups and saucers, firing kilns and developing new shapes and patterns. The work is exacting and often dangerous. The lead in the glazes, the heat of the kilns, the fine dust that coats everything, but it provides employment for thousands. Your own tea set is modest compared to what wealthy families display, but you're proud of it nonetheless. The pieces match, which wasn't always possible for people of your station. The pattern shows willows and bridges in blue, a style that has become enormously popular. Each cup sits in its own saucer, and you have a separate slop bowl for the used leaves, a cream jug, and a sugar bowl with a lid and tiny spoon. The arrangement of these pieces on the table follows unwritten but well understood rules. The teapot commands the centre, usually on a small stand to protect the tablecloth from heat. The cups and saucers are distributed according to the number of guests, each precisely placed. The sugar bowl and cream jug flank the teapot within easy reach but not crowding it. The slop bowl sits slightly apart, positioned where used leaves can be discreetly disposed of without drawing excessive attention to the process. Tablecloths for tea are different from those used for meals. They're lighter, often white or cream, and sometimes embroidered with simple patterns. The fabric must be fine enough to show the quality of the table beneath, yet sturdy enough to withstand repeated use and washing. Stains are disasters. Tea leaves permanent marks on fabric, and a spotted tablecloth suggests carelessness or, worse, poverty. The spoons deserve their own consideration. Teaspoons are smaller than tablespoons, sized specifically for stirring sugar into a teacup without splashing. Silver is preferred, but even modest households usually manage at least silver-plated spoons for tea service. The spoons are displayed in their own holder or sometimes laid beside each cup, handles aligned with mathematical precision. Serving tea to guests has become a performance, one that displays your skill and refinement. You begin by asking each person their preference: milk and sugar, just milk, just sugar, or neither. This seems simple, but remembering everyone's choice and preparing each cup correctly requires concentration, especially when serving a larger group. The order of additions matters. Some insist milk must go in first, claiming this prevents the hot tea from shocking the porcelain and causing hairline cracks. Others argue tea should go in first, allowing you to judge its strength before adding milk. You've adopted the tea first method, believing it gives better control over the final colour and taste. Passing the cups requires grace. You hand each one to its recipient with both hands, making sure the handle is positioned for easy grasping. The saucer stays with the cup. Separating them during service would mark you as hopelessly provincial. Small plates for cake or bread and butter are distributed separately, along with napkins folded into simple triangles. The conversations that happen around these carefully arranged tables range from trivial gossip to serious discussion of politics and philosophy. Tea service has created a space where people gather, where the ritual itself provides structure for social interaction. The pouring and passing, the asking and answering about preferences, the small pauses for sipping, all of this creates a rhythm that makes conversation easier, especially with people you don't know well. You've noticed how tea settings reflect changes in society. 30 years ago, tea was drunk from handleless bowls, and people held the hot porcelain carefully by the rim. Then someone invented the handle, and suddenly the old bowls looked primitive. Now everyone uses handled cups, and the earlier style has nearly disappeared except among the very old or very eccentric. The patterns on the china tell their own story. Chinoiserie, designs featuring Chinese scenes and motifs, dominated for decades as a way of bringing the exotic into English homes. But lately, English subjects are becoming popular: country scenes, flowers, and even images of local landmarks. It's as if tea, having been fully absorbed into English life, no longer needs to advertise its foreign origins. The afternoon has its own tea ceremony, quite different from the simple morning cup. By 1840, you've witnessed the emergence of afternoon tea as a distinct social institution, complete with its own etiquette and expectations. The timing is specific, around 4 o'clock, that peculiar dead zone between lunch and dinner, when energy flags and hunger begins to gnaw. The Duchess of Bedford is credited with inventing this meal, complaining of a sinking feeling in the late afternoon and requesting tea and small cakes be brought to her private rooms. The practice caught on among her friends, then spread through society like ripples in a pond. Afternoon tea is lighter than the working-class high tea served later in the day, which is really more of a supper. This afternoon version features delicate foods designed to sustain without overwhelming. Thin sandwiches with the crusts cut off, small cakes, and scones with jam and clotted cream. The portions are deliberately modest. Eating too much would suggest poor breeding, or worse, genuine hunger. The sandwiches are miniature works of art. Cucumber slices so thin they're nearly transparent, arranged on butter spread with mathematical precision. Egg and cress mixed with just enough mayonnaise to bind. Smoked salmon on brown bread. The crusts are always removed, transforming the sandwiches into neat squares or triangles that sit on plates in carefully composed arrangements. Scones arrive warm from the oven, their tops golden and slightly cracked. The proper way to eat them sparks debate. Some split them horizontally with a knife, while others insist you must break them apart with your hands to preserve the texture. The jam goes on first, then the cream, or perhaps the cream first and then the jam. This choice apparently reveals something profound about your character, though you've never quite understood what. The cream itself is a luxury. Clotted cream, thick enough to hold its shape, comes from Devon or Cornwall, where dairy farms have perfected its production. It's yellowish white, and so rich it coats your mouth, making each bite of scone feel indulgent. In less wealthy households, regular cream or even butter serves as a substitute, though everyone pretends not to notice the difference. Cakes for afternoon tea are smaller than dessert cakes, designed to be eaten in 2 or 3 bites without requiring a fork. Victoria sponge, filled with jam and dusted with sugar, lemon drizzle, glazed and tart, small iced cakes in pastel colours. The variety displayed on a cake stand demonstrates the household's resources and the cook's skill. The conversation during afternoon tea tends toward the pleasant and uncontroversial. This isn't the time for serious political debate or difficult personal disclosures. Instead, you discuss the weather, recent social events, or perhaps a new book or play. The talk flows around the tea service, accommodating the natural pauses created by sipping and eating. Women dominate afternoon tea in a way that isn't true for other meals. Men occasionally attend, but this is primarily female territory, a space where women can gather and talk without male oversight. This makes afternoon tea subtly subversive, a socially acceptable excuse for female independence and friendship. The ritual has become so standardised that deviations feel almost shocking. Serving coffee instead of tea would confuse your guests. Offering large sandwiches or heavy foods would miss the point entirely. Even the timing is fixed. Arrive too early and you'll find your hostess unprepared. Arrive too late and you've missed the event entirely. Your role as hostess during afternoon tea requires constant attention. You must keep the conversation moving without dominating it, ensure everyone's cup stays filled, and notice when someone needs their plate refreshed. You monitor the food supply, signalling the maid to bring more sandwiches or remove empty plates. You observe without seeming to observe, attuned to your guests' comfort and enjoyment. The china used for afternoon tea is often the finest the household owns. This is when you bring out the good porcelain, the set saved for company. The pieces are displayed as much as used, their quality reflecting on your taste and prosperity. A beautiful tea service becomes a conversation piece, admired and complimented, sometimes envied. Outside the windows, the afternoon light shifts from bright to golden, creating a warm glow in the room. This particular quality of light seems designed for tea, softening everything it touches. You've deliberately positioned your tea table near the window to take advantage of this natural illumination, which makes the porcelain seem to glow and the tea itself look like liquid amber. The pause that afternoon tea creates in the day's rhythm has become essential. It marks time, dividing the afternoon from the evening, creating a moment of deliberate rest in lives that are otherwise quite busy. Even on days when you have no guests, you maintain the ritual, taking time to sit properly, to use good china, and to make the afternoon feel somehow significant rather than simply letting it slip past unnoticed. The experience of tea drinking varies dramatically depending on where you live. In your rural cottage in Yorkshire, tea arrives along with other supplies from the market town, brought by a carrier who makes the journey twice weekly. The selection is limited compared to what you remember from visiting London. Perhaps 3 or 4 varieties if you're lucky, and you take what's available rather than choosing from dozens of options. Country tea has a practical quality that urban tea lacks. You drink it in the kitchen rather than a separate drawing room, often still wearing your work clothes, hands scrubbed clean but showing evidence of the day's labour. The ceremony is abbreviated, you still warm the pot and measure carefully, but you skip the elaborate table settings and delicate sandwiches. Instead, you might have thick slices of bread with butter and jam or cold meat left from dinner. The timing in the countryside follows agricultural rhythms rather than social conventions. Morning tea happens whenever you've finished the essential early chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs, and setting bread to rise. Afternoon tea might be taken into the fields during harvest, carried in a tin pot that keeps it reasonably warm, and poured into thick cups that won't break if dropped. Evening tea happens after supper, a moment of rest before the final check of livestock and locking up for the night. Water quality in the countryside is generally excellent. Your well draws from deep underground, producing water so clear and cold it's almost a shame to heat it. This makes your tea taste cleaner somehow than city tea, though you lack the variety and refinement of urban offerings. You've heard that London water, drawn from the Thames, needs extensive filtering and still tastes faintly of the river. In London, by contrast, tea has become a theatre of social complexity. Your cousin who lives in Bloomsbury describes tea parties that involve written invitations, specific dress codes, and elaborate rules about calling cards and departure times. The tea itself is only part of the performance. What matters is being seen drinking it, in the right company, from the right china, in the proper setting. City dwellers have access to specialty tea merchants who blend custom mixtures and sell exotic varieties you've never heard of. They can choose between China Black, Indian Black, green tea, oolong, and countless blended varieties with names like Afternoon Delight or Earl Grey's Mixture. Each type comes with recommendations about brewing time, temperature, and accompaniments. The tea shops themselves are destinations. Your cousin describes walking past window displays featuring pyramids of tea caddies, porcelain sets arranged to catch the light, and hand-painted signs advertising the latest arrivals from India or Ceylon. Inside, the shops smell of all their products at once, tea and coffee and spices mingling in a scent cloud that's simultaneously overwhelming and enticing. Urban tea gardens provide entertainment along with refreshment. At Vauxhall or Ranelagh, you can pay an admission fee to walk among illuminated paths, listen to musical performances, and drink tea served at outdoor tables. These gardens are less respectable than afternoon tea in private homes. They attract a more diverse crowd, including people whose status is questionable, but whose money is good. Country tea is cheaper overall. You buy in smaller quantities, but you also pay less per pound because you're not supporting the overhead of fancy shops and fashionable addresses. Your tea comes in plain paper wrapping rather than decorated caddies, and you store it in a simple tin rather than a locked wooden box. It tastes essentially the same as city tea, but it lacks the symbolic weight. The social meaning of tea varies between city and country. In rural areas, offering tea is simple hospitality, expected and unremarkable. In London, tea invitations are strategic, carrying implications about social status, availability, and relationship quality. Accepting an invitation commits you to reciprocating. Declining requires careful excuse-making. The whole business is exhausting from your perspective, though your cousin seems to thrive on it. Village tea drinking retains a communal quality that city tea has lost. When illness strikes a household, neighbours arrive with pots of tea and whatever food can be spared. After church on Sunday, the congregation often gathers for tea before dispersing to their homes. The tea itself is less important than the gathering, the checking in on each other, and the maintenance of community bonds. City isolation makes tea more of a lifeline. Your cousin describes feeling desperately lonely despite being surrounded by thousands of people, and her afternoon tea invitations are attempts to create connection in a place where simply living near someone doesn't automatically make them a neighbour. The formality of city tea might seem excessive to you, but it serves a purpose. It provides structure for building relationships when natural community doesn't exist. The countryside changes with seasons, and tea adapts accordingly. Summer tea might be drunk cold, a novelty that seems slightly shocking but wonderfully refreshing after hot field work. Winter tea stays close to the fire, drunk from thick pottery that holds heat well. Spring and autumn occupy the middle ground, with tea temperature varying based on the day's weather rather than following a fixed rule. London tea, meanwhile, maintains constant elegance regardless of season. The fires are always lit in drawing rooms, the porcelain is always fine, and the rituals are always observed. This consistency is part of the appeal. In a city that's chaotic and unpredictable, tea provides reliable structure. Tea has reshaped the interior landscape of English homes, creating new furniture, new rooms, and new domestic routines. Your current house, built in 1830, includes features that didn't exist in earlier homes, all designed to accommodate tea drinking. The tea table stands in the drawing room, positioned to catch afternoon light. It's smaller than a dining table, but larger than a side table, the perfect size for displaying a tea service and accommodating plates of food. The wood is mahogany, polished to a high sheen that reflects the china arranged on its surface. Someone invented the tea table as a specific furniture category, and now every moderately prosperous house has one. Near the tea table stands a tea caddy on its own small stand. This caddy is locked, as tea caddies have been for a century, though the price has dropped enough that locking it is more habit than necessity. The caddy interior is divided into compartments, one for black tea, one for green tea, and a centre section for mixing or for storing the sugar bowl. The key hangs on your chatelaine, the ring of household keys that marks your position as mistress of the house. The tea tray has evolved into a specialised object. It's large enough to carry a full tea service, but light enough to be easily portable. The handles are positioned for balanced carrying, and the surface has a low rim to prevent cups from sliding during transport. You own 2 trays, an everyday one of simple wood and a fancier papier-mâché tray painted with flowers and inlaid with mother of pearl for when company comes. A tea kettle sits perpetually ready near the kitchen fire. In wealthier homes, a spirit burner in the drawing room allows the hostess to heat water without leaving the room, maintaining the illusion that tea simply appears without any labour. You find this affectation slightly ridiculous. Everyone knows that water must be heated, leaves must be steeped, and dishes must be washed. Pretending otherwise seems dishonest. The daily rhythm of home life now organises around tea times. Morning tea provides the day's first structure, separating night from day. Afternoon tea marks the transition from work to evening. Evening tea before bed creates closure, a signal that the day has ended. These 3 points anchor the day, giving it shape and predictability. Children learn tea manners almost before they learn to speak. Your youngest daughter, only 4 years old, already knows to hold her cup with both hands, to sip quietly without slurping, and to say please and thank you at appropriate moments. These lessons are gentle but persistent. Proper tea behaviour is considered essential to growing up respectable. The work of tea largely falls to women. You oversee the tea supply, deciding when to order more and what variety to purchase. You train the maids in proper preparation and service. You preside at the tea table when guests arrive. Your husband drinks the tea and enjoys the social occasions, but the logistics are your domain, part of the invisible labour that makes the household function smoothly. Washing the tea things is more challenging than you'd expect. The porcelain must be handled carefully to prevent chips and cracks. Tea stains require special attention. They'll set permanently if not removed immediately. The inside of the teapot develops a dark coating over time, and opinions differ about whether this patina improves the flavour or should be scrubbed away. You've settled on a gentle cleaning routine that seems to preserve both the pot and the taste. Storage space for tea equipment has become substantial. You need room for multiple teapots, sets of cups and saucers, cream jugs, sugar bowls, slop bowls, tea caddies, trays, and all the small implements that accumulate around the ritual. A sideboard in your drawing room is dedicated entirely to tea storage, with additional pieces kept in the kitchen for everyday use. The cost of maintaining a proper tea household is significant, but no longer prohibitive for middle-class families. Between the tea itself, the sugar, the milk, the fuel to heat water, the replacement of broken dishes, and the occasional purchase of new pieces to expand your collection, you spend several pounds annually just on tea-related expenses. Your mother would have considered this extravagant, but it's become normal in your generation. Tea has influenced architectural design in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The drawing room's large windows aren't just for light, they're specifically for afternoon tea light, creating the right atmosphere for social tea drinking. The distance between the kitchen and drawing room in newer houses is calculated to allow servants enough time to prepare a tray, without making the journey so long that tea cools during transport. Some very wealthy families have installed speaking tubes that connect the drawing room to the kitchen, allowing the mistress to order tea without standing or ringing a bell. You find this innovation excessive. Surely walking to the kitchen or ringing a bell isn't such a hardship. But you understand the appeal of appearing effortlessly served. The ritual of tea has created its own vocabulary within the household. Tea things refers to all the equipment collectively. The tea hour means mid-afternoon, even when no tea is actually consumed. Taking tea means visiting someone, even if coffee is ultimately served. The language has expanded to accommodate the practice. Your personal relationship with tea has become complicated. You genuinely enjoy it, the taste, the ritual, the social connections it facilitates. But you're also aware of its demands on your time, money, and attention. Some mornings, you long for the simplicity your grandmother described, when breakfast meant bread and beer, and nothing required such careful preparation. Then you take that first sip of properly brewed tea, feel its warmth spread through you, and remember why the effort seems worthwhile. The evening cup carries a different character than morning or afternoon tea. By 1850, you've settled into a routine that feels both comforting and slightly melancholy. The day ending, the house growing quiet, the final tasks completed. Evening tea happens after supper's been cleared and the household has shifted into its nighttime mode. The children are in bed, the servants have finished most of their work, and you finally have time to sit without feeling you should be doing something else. This is when tea becomes less about society and more about personal restoration. You brew the evening pot with care equal to the morning's but different in intention. Morning tea must energise and prepare you for the day. Evening tea should soothe and settle, creating the right mental state for sleep. Some people claim certain teas are better suited for evening, varieties that are less stimulating and gentler on the system. You're not sure this is true, but you've adopted the practice anyway, choosing lighter blends as night approaches. The evening cup is often drunk in near silence. Your husband reads his newspaper by the fire, turning pages with slow deliberation. You might have mending or correspondence, but often you simply sit, holding the warm cup, letting your mind wander through the day's events. The tea provides occupation for your hands and a focal point for your attention without demanding much of either. Winter evenings are particularly suited to tea. The darkness outside seems absolute, pressing against the windows, but inside the fire glows and the tea steams and the room holds warmth like a secret. You've noticed how tea drinking makes cold nights tolerable, even pleasant. The ritual creates coziness and transforms what could be bleak into something almost magical. In summer, evening tea is lighter, sometimes drunk barely warm, and more refreshing than hot. The later sunset means you might take your tea outside, sitting in the garden while light lingers in the sky. The flavour seems different outdoors. You taste the air along with the tea, and somehow the combination is perfect. The evening pot is rarely shared with guests. This is private time, family time, the gentle unwinding after the day's performance. If someone calls in the evening, you offer tea out of politeness, but there's a slight resentment at the intrusion. Evening tea belongs to the household, not to society. Your evening tea includes reflection on the day's conversations. Afternoon tea with guests often surfaces memories in the evening. Something someone said, a bit of gossip shared, or a concern expressed. You turn these fragments over in your mind while sipping, processing the day's social information in the quiet space tea creates. The dishes used for evening tea are often different from afternoon's fine china. You might use thicker cups, less elegant but more practical for the relaxed atmosphere. Or sometimes you use the good china precisely because there's no one to impress, enjoying it purely for your own pleasure rather than for display. Evening tea marks the transition from the public self to the private one. During the day, you maintain certain standards of appearance and behaviour. As evening deepens, you allow yourself to relax. Your posture softens, and your expression becomes less guarded. The tea witnesses this transformation, this shedding of the day's necessary masks. Children, when they're still awake, sometimes join evening tea. They're quieter at this hour, tired from their own day's activities. You let them have weak tea with extra milk and sugar, training them in the ritual while they're sleepy and docile. These evening sessions teach them that tea time can be peaceful, not just social. The last cup of the day is drunk slowly. You're in no hurry to finish it, and anyway, bed will come soon enough. The tea is cooled to barely warm, but you finish it anyway, not wanting to waste it. The final sip tastes different from the first, less vibrant, more familiar and comforting in its ordinariness. Banking the fire for the night happens after tea is done. The The coals are covered with ash, damped down to hold heat until morning. The tea things are collected and carried to the kitchen, where they'll be washed first thing tomorrow. The drawing room gradually cools as you extinguish lamps and candles, leaving only what's needed to find your way upstairs. In bed, you sometimes still taste the tea, a phantom flavour lingering on your tongue. Your thoughts drift and settle like the tea leaves at the bottom of the pot. Sleep comes gradually, peacefully. The day's tensions dissolved like sugar in hot water. Tomorrow you'll wake and begin again with morning tea, the cycle continuing, each day bookended by the same gentle ritual. Spring tea has arrived with the crocuses and longer days. By March you've tired of winter's heavy foods and dark afternoons, and you crave something lighter and fresher. The tea itself might be the same variety you drank all winter, but you serve it differently, in thinner cups, with less sugar, accompanied by the first strawberries from the greenhouse, or delicate lemon biscuits that taste of sunshine. The spring cleaning ritual includes the tea things. You empty the tea caddy completely, wipe it clean inside and out, and check for any dampness or musty smells. The porcelain comes down from the shelves, each piece washed carefully in warm water, inspected for chips or cracks, and dried with soft cloths. This annual cleaning feels like renewal, preparing your tea equipment for another year of service. As the weather warms, you begin taking tea outdoors. The garden table is brought out of storage, wiped down and positioned under the apple tree, where dappled shade keeps the sun from being too intense. Drinking tea in the garden feels slightly daring, as if you're breaking an unspoken rule about tea belonging indoors. But the pleasure is undeniable. The fresh air, the bird song, and the scent of growing things mixing with the tea's aroma. Summer tea evolves into something almost entirely different from winter's version. You experiment with serving it cold, pouring hot tea over ice made from the ice house. The result tastes strange at first. Tea should be hot, your mind insists, but the refreshment is remarkable. Cold tea on a hot July afternoon becomes a revelation, though you're not sure you'd admit to drinking it this way in front of company. The summer abundance affects tea accompaniments. Thin cucumber sandwiches make perfect sense when cucumbers are fresh from the garden. Fruit tarts feature whatever has just ripened. Currants, raspberries, or gooseberries. You make less cake in summer. The oven's heat makes the kitchen unbearable, and anyway, lighter foods suit the season better. August tea happens later in the day as you wait for temperatures to become bearable. The afternoon tea hour shifts from 4 o'clock to 5 or even 6, catching the cooler evening air. The ritual adjusts to the season, proving more flexible than you'd expected. Tea accommodates itself to life rather than demanding life accommodate it. Autumn brings back the pleasure of hot tea after months of drinking it barely warm. The first truly cold morning, when you can see your breath in the bedroom, makes the morning cup taste especially good. The warmth spreads through you, chasing away the chill, reminding you of tea's fundamental purpose, comfort. Harvest season disrupts normal tea routines. The work is too pressing to pause for afternoon tea, so you drink it quickly in the kitchen, standing rather than sitting, before returning to the fields. The elaborate social ritual falls away, leaving only the essential function: warmth, energy, brief respite. You remember that tea served working people before it became a drawing room entertainment. November fog makes tea taste somehow richer. You can't explain this logically, but you've noticed it year after year. Perhaps it's the dampness in the air, or the way firelight looks through fog-dimmed windows, or simply the seasonal association between tea and cosy interiors when the weather outside is miserable. Whatever the cause, foggy day tea feels like being embraced. December brings social tea to its peak. The visiting season demands constant readiness. Your tea caddy is always full, your best china always clean, and your pantry stocked with cake and biscuits for unexpected guests. You pour more tea in December than any other month, your wrist actually growing tired from lifting the pot. Christmas tea includes special editions. Spiced biscuits flavoured with ginger and cinnamon appear on the tea table. The sugar bowl holds shaped sugar instead of the usual lumps. You might add a cinnamon stick to the pot itself, creating a flavoured tea that tastes like the season. These small variations mark the time as special without requiring elaborate effort. The darkest days of winter make evening tea essential. By 4 o'clock it's nearly dark and the long evening stretches ahead. Tea punctuates this darkness, creating islands of light and warmth to hold on to. You drink more tea in winter than summer, your body craving both the warmth and the ritual's reassuring familiarity. New Year tea carries a contemplative quality. The year has turned, and you sit with your cup considering what's past and what might come. Tea doesn't change with the calendar, but your relationship to it shifts slightly. You notice it more consciously, appreciating the continuity it provides across years and seasons. February is the hardest month, when winter feels endless and spring seems impossibly distant. Tea doesn't fix this, but it helps. The morning cup is a promise that the day has begun, and will therefore eventually end. The evening cup is a small reward for surviving another day. The ritual carries you through when motivation fails. Each season teaches you something new about tea, though you've been drinking it for decades. Spring teaches freshness, summer teaches flexibility, autumn teaches gratitude, and winter teaches endurance. The cycle repeats annually, and tea is there for all of it, adapting and persisting as reliable as the changing seasons themselves. By 1875, tea had become so thoroughly English that its foreign origins seemed almost impossible to believe. You've watched 3 generations adopt and adapt this ritual, each making it their own while maintaining its essential character. What began as exotic curiosity has become a daily necessity, woven into the fabric of life so completely that imagining England without tea feels absurd. The democratization of tea represents one of the century's quiet revolutions. Your grandmother paid a fortune for tea and locked it away like jewellery. Your mother paid less but still considered it a luxury. You pay prices that make tea accessible for ordinary consumption, and your daughter will likely pay even less. This price decline has transformed tea from a symbol of wealth into something available to nearly everyone. The ritual persists even as its trappings change. Porcelain has become cheaper and more available, but tea is still poured with care. The ceremony has simplified in some households while growing more elaborate in others, but the essential act, hot water, tea leaves, a moment of pause, remains constant. Tea has proven remarkably adaptable, fitting into diverse lives and circumstances while retaining its character. You've noticed how tea marks life's significant moments. Births are celebrated with tea parties, funerals include tea afterward, the bereaved gather to drink and remember, weddings feature tea receptions, illnesses are nursed with cups of tea brought to bedsides. The beverage has become inseparable from the full range of human experience. Tea creates community in ways both obvious and subtle. The shared ritual provides common ground between strangers. The knowledge of how to brew, serve and drink tea is a language everyone speaks, regardless of class or region. Differences exist, urban versus rural, working class versus aristocracy, but the basic grammar is universal. The health claims surrounding tea have mostly been forgotten or disproven. It doesn't cure headaches or prevent plague or make the body lusty, despite what early merchants promised. But it does provide comfort, create moments of rest, and encourage social connection. These benefits, less dramatic than medical cures, are perhaps more valuable for being real and reliable. Your own tea drinking has evolved over the decades. You've developed preferences you didn't have in youth, a particular strength of brew, a specific cup you favour, and times of day when tea tastes better. These personal refinements are part of tea's appeal. The ritual is shared, but within it, infinite individual variation is possible. The future of tea seems secure. India and Ceylon now produce vast quantities, ensuring supply will meet demand. Tea plantations employ thousands, creating an entire industry around English appetites. The price continues to drop as production increases. Tea has moved from luxury to staple, joining bread and milk as something ordinary people expect to have regularly. Looking at the tea things arranged on your table, the pot, the cups, the sugar bowl and the cream jug, you think about all the hands that touched these objects before they reached you. Workers who picked the leaves in distant fields, sailors who transported the cargo across oceans, merchants who sold the tea, porcelain and sugar separately. The connections span the globe, yet here they converge in your drawing room, reduced to a simple domestic ritual. Tea has taught you patience. The leaves won't steep faster because you're in a hurry. The water must reach proper temperature regardless of your schedule. The ritual demands its own time, and this insistence on unhurried care has shaped how you approach other aspects of life. Some things can't and shouldn't be rushed. The sensory memory of tea will likely be among your last to fade. The aroma of leaves in the caddy, the sound of water poured into the pot, the warmth of the cup in your hands, the taste of that first sip. These experiences have repeated thousands of times, creating deep grooves in memory. In old age, you suspect you'll still know how to make tea even if you forget other things. Tea's greatest gift might be the permission it grants for rest. In a world that increasingly values productivity and efficiency, tea time remains defiantly unproductive. You sit, you drink, you talk or think or simply exist. This deliberate pause has become necessary for maintaining sanity in a modernising world that might otherwise consume you completely. As evening approaches and shadows lengthen across the drawing room floor, you prepare one more pot. The ritual is exactly as it's always been. Warming the pot, measuring the leaves, pouring the water, and waiting the correct number of minutes. Your hands perform these actions without conscious thought, the motions as natural as breathing. The tea is ready. You pour a cup, add milk and sugar in the proportions you prefer, and lift it to your lips. The taste is familiar, yet somehow always slightly new, like meeting an old friend and discovering there are still things you don't know about them. The warmth spreads through you, and for this moment everything feels manageable, peaceful, and enough. Outside, the world continues its relentless change. Inside, the tea steeps and the fire glows and the day draws gently toward its close. You sit with your cup, grateful for this small ritual that has carried you through decades, that will carry your children and their children forward through whatever changes come. Tea endures, and in its endurance it offers a kind of comfort that transcends the beverage itself, the reassurance that some good things last, that tradition has value, and that taking time to sit with a cup of tea is never time wasted. The light fades, the tea cools. You finish the last sip and set the cup down with a soft click against the saucer. Tomorrow you'll do this again, and the day after that, and the day after that. The ritual will continue season after season, year after year, connecting you to the past and to the future through this simple, essential act. And for now, in this quiet moment, that's enough. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, France was a land of contrasts. By candlelight in a grand chateau's garden, a curious noblewoman listens as a witty philosopher describes the stars above. He explains that those stars are suns like our own, each perhaps circled by the worlds of their own, a radical idea in an age when questioning the heavens could be dangerous. The scene could be lifted from Bernard de Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, 1686, a clever book where a lady and a scientist stroll nightly under the sky discussing Copernicus's sun-centered universe. Fontenelle's charming prose made the latest scientific discoveries accessible to the layperson, planting seeds of curiosity, even as Louis XIV's strict rule cast long shadows. His ideas, along with those of fellow thinker Pierre Bayle, formed a foundation for what would soon be called the Enlightenment. At the turn of the 18th century, official France was still firmly absolutist and devoutly Catholic. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, driving Protestants like Bailey into exile. Yet even as the king insisted on religious unity, dissenting ideas quietly took root. In his Safe Haven Abroad, Bayle wrote a sceptical historical and critical dictionary, 1697, that poked holes in dogma and advocated tolerance. These volumes, printed in Amsterdam and London, were smuggled over the borders in barrels of cloth and hidden compartments, finding eager readers in Paris and Lyon. A tradition was beginning. Forbidden ideas could not be easily extinguished. Bailey's call for a society of pluralistic views, a daring notion that people of different beliefs might live together in peace, resonated with a small but growing circle of French minds. Quietly, the monopoly of church and crown on truth was being challenged by pamphlets and letters passed hand to hand. After Louis XIV's death in 1715, the atmosphere in France relaxed somewhat, allowing these early sparks to flare up. In Paris, coffee houses and literary clubs buzzed with talk. One towering figure of this early Enlightenment was Baron de Montesquieu, a provincial nobleman with a dry wit and keen insight. In 1721, Montesquieu published The Persian Letters, a playful novel of letters in which two fictional Persian travellers lampoon French customs. Nothing was sacred in its pages. Parisian high society, the pretensions of the king's court, the absurdities of the Catholic clergy, all were held up to gentle ridicule through these eyes of outsiders. Readers were amused and intrigued. Beneath the satire lay serious critiques of absolutism and religious hypocrisy. The book, though published anonymously, created a stir. It was passed from salon to salon, read aloud in amused whispers. France's own institutions were being examined as if under a foreign lens, and many found them wanting. Montesquieu's success emboldened others. Soon he would take his analysis further. Retiring to his estate, he quietly toiled on a magnum opus about laws and governments around the world. By the 1730s, the term philosophy was coming into use. Not quite the same as philosopher, it meant a man, or occasionally a woman, of ideas who applied reason to all areas of life. These Enlightenment thinkers saw themselves as bringing light into the dark corners of ignorance and oppression. They drew inspiration from English writers like John Locke and scientists like Isaac Newton, whose works were now circulating in French translation. In fact, a fashionable young writer named Voltaire had travelled to England and returned in 1729 bubbling with enthusiasm for Newton's physics and the English spirit of free debate. He set about spreading both. With his vivacious lover Émilie du Châtelet, herself a brilliant mathematician, Voltaire explained Newton's findings in French and praised England as relatively liberal society in his letters on the English. Though the French authorities condemned his book and briefly imprisoned its author for it, the ideas could not be unread. The taste of intellectual freedom abroad only sharpened French appetites for more. Thus, in the decades before the Revolution, the early stirrings of Enlightenment thought took hold. A handful of bold voices, Fontenelle with his popular science, Bayle with his sceptical erudition, Montesquieu with his satire, and Voltaire with his sharp pen, prepared the ground. Their writing circulated in manuscript and in contraband print, fertilising minds from Paris to the provinces. Over supper tables and university halls, people began asking new questions. Could reason, not tradition, guide human affairs? Must religious uniformity trump individual conscience? Could a king's authority have limits set by natural law? These questions, sown in the early 1700s, would sprout dramatically as the century progressed. For now they were still whispered, but the Enlightenment in France had begun, a dawn of new thinking that promised to chase away medieval shadows. In the mid-18th century, some of the most radical ideas in France were not plotted in dark alleys but discussed over champagne in elegant drawing rooms. The Parisian salon was a unique institution, part social club, part intellectual seminar, typically hosted by a wealthy or aristocratic woman, the salonière. These gatherings brought together writers, philosophers, artists and statesmen under one chandelier. On a given evening you might find the sharp-tongued Voltaire trading barbs with a bishop, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau shyly unveiling his latest essay to a circle of curious marquises. Salons were private and by invitation only, yet they became engines of public discourse. There was a democratic, cosmopolitan and tolerant atmosphere, rare for the time nobles, bourgeoisie, and even an occasional artisan or foreign savant mingled politely, united by a love of wit and ideas. Here Enlightenment thought took on a human face as diverse guests debated art, science, and politics late into the night. The women who ran these salons wielded subtle power in a society that otherwise confined female influence. Take Madame Geoffrin, for example. Born Marie-Thérèse Rodet-Geoffrin by the 1740s, she had established herself as the premier hostess of Paris. Every Monday, her well-appointed home on the Rue Saint-Honoré welcomed the leading writers and philosophes to dinner. Wednesdays were reserved for artists. With motherly charm, Madame Geoffrin presided over the conversation, tactfully steering away from overly explosive topics so as to keep the gathering convivial. She even provided financial support to struggling men of letters, quietly paying debts or buying paintings from her artist guests. The respect she commanded was such that even the crusty Voltaire deferred to her. In her salon one had to follow certain rules. Wit was appreciated, but vulgarity was not. Lively debate was welcome, but shouting and personal attacks were frowned upon. Under her guidance the tone remained civil, clever, and enlightening, a model of the refinement of manners and speech that salons originally aimed for. Other salonières adopted different styles. Madame de Du-Deffand, an older contemporary of Geoffrin, hosted gatherings from 1745 onward, but famously disdained the more radical philosophe, except for Voltaire, whom she adored. Her salon favoured high society gossip and classical letters over bold new philosophy. In contrast, the witty Mademoiselle Julie de Lespinasse ran a more freewheeling salon in the 1770s. Julie had been tutored in the art by Madame du Deffand until a falling out, and, with a small stipend from Madame Geoffrin, struck out on her own. She innovated by opening her home almost every evening to a select but mixed company. Young intellectuals, older statesmen and foreign visitors. Nibbles and wine were served, nothing lavish, but the talk flowed. One frequent guest, the writer Jean-François Marmontel marvelled at Julia's ability to inspire frank discussion. He described her as an astonishing compound of reason and wisdom, with the liveliest mind and most ardent soul. Under her edifice, philosophers from diverse generations convened and exchanged ideas, while even the poorest scholars were welcome to express their thoughts. Such inclusion was unusual. In many salons, one's rank and attire still mattered, but Julia de Lespinasse proved that intellectual passion could trump pedigree. A typical salon evening might unfold like this. As dusk fell, a liveried footman admitted guests to a candlelit parlour decorated with art. Gentle music played in the next room. Elegant women in silks and men in embroidered coats formed small clusters, exchanging news and bons mots. The hostess circulated, deftly introducing a young poet to a renowned scientist or drawing a shy scholar into a lively debate about the latest play. Conversation was the main event. A good salon guest had something to bring to this conversation, at the very least wit and elegant French. A rising dramatist might recite a scene from his new comedy, met with applause and gentle critique. A visiting American like Benjamin Franklin might regale the company with tales of scientific experiments with lightning. Serious discussions could break out, the merits of Voltaire's newest tract or Rousseau's eccentric theories on education. But if tempers flared or someone droned on too long, the hostess would smoothly change the subject or propose a diversion, perhaps a brief chamber music performance or a round of cards. The result was a peculiar mix of ludic and learned. By evening's end, ideas that might have been seditious in print could be bandied about safely in the salon, cushioned by politeness and mutual respect. The salon thus served as an incubator for Enlightenment ideas. It connected thinkers to patrons. Many an author found a publisher or a financier through salon contacts. It allowed women a rare opportunity to engage in intellectual life, albeit as conveners rather than professors, with notable exceptions like Emily du Châtelet, who, though not a salonière, proved women could match men in science. Salons also helped erode class barriers, if only slightly. Some hostesses prided themselves on gathering a potpourri of talents regardless of noble birth. There were limits, of course. Peasants and labourers did not stroll into these parlours. The salons primarily catered to the elite, who were open to new talent and ideas, not just those inherited from their lineage. In these candlelit rooms, the public sphere had a private cradle. Before newspapers could freely criticise the king or church, and before any elected assembly existed in France, the salons were training grounds for reasoned debate. They fostered what one historian later called the Republic of Letters, a community of minds that transcended social ranks and national borders. Foreigners like the Scottish historian David Hume or the Italian economist Cesare Beccaria were feted at Paris salons when they visited. In turn, French philosophers built networks of correspondence with thinkers abroad. The cosmopolitan chatter in Madame Geoffrin's salon had echoes in London, Geneva or Berlin as ideas spread. By the 1770s and 1780s, even as economic troubles and political conflict loomed in France, one could still find on any given evening a salon in full swing, a microcosm of an ideal Enlightenment society, where conversation flowed freely, differences were bridged by civility, and a new rational France was imagined in talk long before it existed in fact. By the middle of the 18th century, the written word in France was undergoing an explosive proliferation. In bustling Parisian print shops and in secret presses hidden in attics or across the border, printers churned out mountains of paper, books, pamphlets, journals, broadsides. An insatiable reading public had arisen, hungry for everything from scandalous verse to serious treatises on philosophy. The statistics tell part of the story. By the 1780s, literacy had risen markedly. Roughly half of French men and a quarter of women could read, almost double the rates from a century earlier. More people reading meant more demand for reading material. Where the state or the church tried to censor or limit that material, enterprising publishers found ways to supply it regardless. A veritable underground press emerged, and with it a new kind of intellectual warrior, the hack writer and the clandestine bookseller. Together they would spread Enlightenment ideas to every corner of France, even as authorities scrambled to stem the tide. Officially, the French crown maintained strict censorship. All books were supposed to be approved by royal censors and carry the censor's name. Hundreds of titles were outright banned. The Catholic Church, through the Sorbonne faculty and the infamous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Prohibited Books, also condemned works deemed heretical or immoral. Punishments for illegal printing could be severe: fines, imprisonment, even the gallows for repeat offenders. But by the 1770s, enforcement was increasingly like plugging holes in a sieve. The appetite for new ideas was too strong and the profits to be made from satisfying it too tempting. Smugglers carried forbidden books into France by the crate, stashing them in false-bottom wagons, or floating them down rivers at night. It was said that in some frontier towns, nearly every customs officer could be bribed. Meanwhile, within France, pirate printers secretly duplicated popular works without permission. One way or another, what was officially banned often ended up widely read. A few examples illustrate the cat-and-mouse game of publishing. In 1759, the monumental project of the Encyclopédie, the great encyclopedia of sciences, arts, and trades edited by Denis Diderot, was banned by King Louis XV after the first 7 volumes, under pressure from church authorities who found its articles too impious. But Diderot did not abandon it. Thanks to sympathetic insiders, not least the enlightened censor Malgerbe, Diderot continued the work in secret, finishing 10 more volumes of articles and plates under a false imprint in Switzerland. Officially, the encyclopedies were suppressed. In reality, subscribers received the remaining volumes clandestinely by 1765. As one contemporary quipped, the authorities had winked at the enterprise. They pretended to shut it down to appease the church, but turned a blind eye to its continued existence because it employed hundreds of workers and had powerful supporters. This delicate dance, ban in name, tolerate in practice, typified the later old regime's lax censorship. By 1780, Diderot's encyclopédie stood complete at 35 volumes, an astonishing trove of Enlightenment knowledge made available to the public, despite all edicts to the contrary. In addition to the Encyclopédie, Geneva, Amsterdam, London, and the Rhineland produced illicit literature. Scholars believe that around 600 prohibited books circulated in France before the Revolution. These included philosophical books, scurrilous political pamphlets, and censored novels. According to historian Robert Darnton, several were forbidden bestsellers, books too filthy or seditious for the censors, but eagerly read by everyone who could. Rousseau's Emile on education and the social contract were prohibited in 1762, but pirated volumes spread and made him famous. Obscene leaflets criticising the royal family's morals and crazy stories about the king's ministers were other underground bestsellers. Grub Street writers, hack authors living hand-to-mouth in Paris who wrote whatever sold, specialised in libelles, libellous pamphlets. To get money, such writers might mock the king's mistress one week, compose a natural rights tract the next, and spy for the police the next. Voltaire and Diderot mocked this literary underworld. Voltaire called hack writers things. Ironically, radical ideas sometimes spread through these less recognised venues. The hackers, hungry and alienated from the previous regime, hated authority and fueled the revolution. Print circulation is immense. A recent police inventory of a seized bookstore or the Bastille's confiscated shipment documents shows thousands of illegal books. Popular illegal titles have been republished many times. In the 70s, the Swiss underground publisher Société Typographique de Neuchâtel transported tens of thousands of volumes into France, from Voltaire's philosophical fables to prohibited novels. By 1796, 20 sanctioned and 50 pirated volumes of the forbidden anti-colonial work History of the Two Indies 1770 surfaced. Abbé Raynal's History of the Two Indies, which boldly denounced slavery and tyranny, was banned by the French government and exiled, while the clergy despised him as one of the most seditious writers, which only piqued readers' interest. Despite the embargo, the book was a bestseller and influenced American colonists with its human rights advocacy. The paradox of French Enlightenment publishing was that repression often increased a work's fame and audience. Reading revolutions spread outside the capital. Provincial cities developed lending libraries and reading societies, where members pooled funds to buy books and newspapers under the watchful eye of a suspicious bishop or magistrate. Literature was available to many residents and artisans by the 1780s. Budget-friendly Bibliothèque Bleue books simplified Enlightenment ideals, fairy tales, and practical information. Peddlers sold chapbooks in local marketplaces, spreading new ideas. In a tavern, a peasant may hear a hot story about the king's mistress, or a Voltaire joke. Of course, not everyone liked this print deluge. Conservative voices argued that excessive reading, especially forbidden materials, was corrupting ordinary people. One booklet at a time, some worried that authority was losing respect. They were partly right. Before 1789, printed words affected French public opinion. The pamphlet avalanche swayed public opinion after high-profile scandals or trials, like the Diamond Necklace Affair, 1785, involving Queen Marie Antoinette. Enlightenment authors inform and influence public opinion. They thought education and critical thinking could improve society. It worked, but it also fueled high expectations and simmering discontent. A prison kiosk sold a cheap Rousseau leaflet on the eve of the Revolution stating, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." A bawdy song mocking the fat archbishop or a broadsheet celebrating America's successful uprising against its ruler were available. Rights, liberty and equality, formerly discussed in salons, have permeated common consciousness. The future was printed on legal and unlawful presses. Despite their efforts, the old order's guardians could not unprint it. The clatter of the printer's type and the rustle of secretly turned pages shook a changing France. In a modest Paris apartment in the 1750s, two brilliant men sit exchanging letters, not amicably, but as rivals locked in intellectual combat. On one side is Voltaire, the most famous wit of the age, now in his 60s, polished, urbane, a skeptic who relishes skewering folly. On the other, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 2 decades younger, intensely earnest, a loner who distrusts the very society Voltaire so enjoys. They rarely meet in person, but across miles they trade barbs in print. Upon reading Rousseau's latest work, Voltaire cannot resist sending a withering reply. "I have received, sir, your new book against the human species, and I thank you for it," Voltaire writes with biting sarcasm. "No one has ever employed so much intelligence to make us all stupid. Reading your book inspires a strong desire to take action." His words drip with mock praise. Rousseau's idealization of primitive man, Voltaire implies, is absurd. Civilization may be flawed, but it's far better than the savage life Rousseau extols. This famous quip that Rousseau's philosophy is enough to make a man want to become a beast epitomizes the clash between two towering Enlightenment thinkers whose visions of human nature and society were worlds apart. The Enlightenment was not a singular entity, rather, it represented a multitude of diverse perspectives, frequently engaged in intense debate. Voltaire and Rousseau's rivalry is legendary. Voltaire championed reason, science, and a certain cosmopolitan elitism. He believed enlightened monarchs, ideally advised by philosophers like himself, could gradually improve society. Religion, to Voltaire, was useful as a social glue, but needed purging of superstition. Écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing, a fanaticism he would famously declare of the Church's abuses. Rousseau, by contrast, distrusted the pretensions of polite society. He thought civilization had corrupted man's originally good nature. In works like Discourse on Inequality, he argued that arts and sciences had led not to progress, but to vanity and oppression. His ideal was a simpler life in harmony with nature, and a political community based on genuine equality and the general will of the people, as he later outlined in the Social Contract. To Voltaire, the idea sounded naive at best, dangerous at worst. Their correspondence started courteously but soured over time. After the devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755, Voltaire wrote a poem questioning providence. How could a just God slaughter innocents? Rousseau oddly rebuked Voltaire, saying people should not question God's plan, and that if men didn't live packed in cities, the quake would do less harm. Voltaire privately scoffed that Rousseau wanted to send mankind backwards. "One longs, in reading your book, to walk on all fours," he jeered, stung by Rousseau's critique. Rousseau, for his part, grew increasingly convinced that Voltaire and his clique were conspiring against him, mocking him behind his back. By the 70s, their relationship had fractured completely. Rousseau even refused Voltaire's offer of refuge when Rousseau was fleeing arrest. The Voltaire-Rousseau split was not just personal, it symbolized a deeper divergence in Enlightenment thought. Voltaire stood for the party of reason, progress through enlightened authority and sharp criticism of tradition. Rousseau became the voice of the party of feeling, valuing emotion, authenticity, and the wisdom of the common man over the polished salon sophisticate of Clégue. Their quarrel highlighted contradictions. The Enlightenment celebrated reason, yet Rousseau accused reason's apostles of being cold and elitist. It preached equality, yet Voltaire privately disdained the uneducated masses and preferred benevolent despotism to democracy. In their ways, each was prophetic. Voltaire of the liberal, secular values that would shape modern Europe, Rousseau of the romantic, democratic, and even revolutionary currents that would soon erupt. It's fitting that both men died in 1778, a decade before the Revolution, almost as if fate meant to clear the stage for the drama to come. Beyond this famous duo, the Enlightenment was rife with intellectual rivalries and collaborations. Diderot and D'Alembert, co-editors of the Encyclopédie, had their share of squabbles. D'Alembert quit the project in frustration in 1759, leaving Diderot to slog through the remaining volumes largely alone. Diderot also fell out bitterly with Rousseau, who had once been his close friend. Diderot and Baron de Holbach welcomed Rousseau as a kindred spirit in the 1740s, but as Rousseau's ideas diverged and his paranoia grew, he came to believe Diderot had portrayed him negatively in a satirical play. Their friendship collapsed, illustrating how personal slights could fracture even those working for the same broad cause. Meanwhile, Baron de Holbach, host of a famously irreverent salon of atheists, published The System of Nature 1770, a book denying the existence of God outright. This extreme materialism alarmed even Voltaire, who attacked Holbach's atheism as fanatical in its own way. Voltaire believed society needed belief in God as a moral bedrock. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him, he quipped. Holbach and Diderot, however, privately ridiculed Voltaire's deism as a lack of nerve. To them, reason pointed to a universe without need of a divine being. Thus, even among philosophes united against the Church's tyranny, there were deep fractures about religion's role. Another poignant clash involved Montesquieu and Rousseau's political theory. Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, argued for a balanced constitution, like Britain's, with powers separated among king, parliament, and courts, a moderate vision to prevent despotism. Rousseau's Social Contract, 1762, dismissed Montesquieu's model as too aristocratic. Instead, Rousseau envisioned a republic so egalitarian that, in theory, everyone would obey laws they themselves willed. Voltaire found Rousseau's political ideas as impractical as his primitivism. He quipped that Rousseau's ideal republic was a city of ghosts, and indeed Rousseau's notion that citizens be forced to be free if they violate the general will would trouble critics for its potential for tyranny. Yet these quarrels were not destructive in the long run. Rather, they enriched the Enlightenment's legacy by presenting contrasting ideas that later generations could draw upon. In the salons and in print, rival philosophers might lampoon each other, but they also all contributed to a broader movement questioning the status quo. Occasionally the debates got personal and nasty. Pamphlets full of character assassination flew about. Voltaire was a master of the artful insult. When a pompous critic, the Abbé Desfontaines, attacked him, Voltaire retaliated by portraying Desfontaines as a criminal and a fool in a biting satire, effectively destroying the man's reputation. Rousseau too lashed out. In his later years, he wrote withering letters accusing former friends of treachery. Still, these human dramas had larger consequences. The sharp exchanges clarified differences in thought. What was the best form of government? The true foundation of morality? What is the role of religion? Through argument, the philosophy refined their positions. By the 70s, a new generation was emerging too. Figures like Condorcet, a mathematician and protégé of D'Alembert, admired both Voltaire and Rousseau trying to synthesize Enlightenment ideals with practical reforms. Condorcet would advocate for the abolition of slavery and women's rights, pushing the Enlightenment's egalitarian logic further than his predecessors dared. Meanwhile, the rifts among the older philosophers presaged splits in the coming revolution. Aristocratic liberals versus radical democrats, deists versus atheists, and pragmatists versus idealists. The Enlightenment was not one sun but a constellation, with Voltaire and Rousseau as two bright stars often in eclipse of each other. Their clashes, bitter though they were, gave the era much of its dynamism. The salon gossip about Voltaire versus Rousseau was the talk of intellectual Europe. Interestingly, when both Rousseau and Voltaire passed away in 1778, they received brief eulogies as if they had been complementary heroes. Within a few years, the French Revolution would enshrine them by interring both their ashes in the Panthéon in Paris, Voltaire in 1791, Rousseau in 94, symbolically reconciling the two in the Republic of Posterity. France, it turned out, would need both Voltaire's razor wit and Rousseau's passionate cry for freedom as it hurtled toward a new age. The Palace of Versailles courtyard was packed on a sunny September afternoon in 1783, with eyes fixed on the sky. Two provincial brothers, the Montgolfier brothers, were ready to attempt the first hot air balloon flight by the living creatures in front of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. A sheep, duck and rooster were placed into a wicker basket under a taffeta balloon at the sound of a cannon. A second cannon fire announced release. As the balloon gracefully climbed 600 metres, tens of thousands of people gasped. It carried its barnyard aeronauts through the heavens for 8 minutes. Royal biologists quickly examined the animals, which were alive and eating hay, after it softly landed a few kilometres away. The audience applauded. The king was thrilled, albeit the inventors deftly avoided his suggestion to use convicted felons as test passengers. More than amusement, this balloon flight symbolised the Enlightenment's faith in science and reason to expand the conceivable. That moment, even the ancient dream of flight seemed possible. Ingenuity and experimentation had turned imagination into reality before the French public. French Enlightenment science pervaded daily life and great politics. Savants, learned men, and a few women, who passionately studied nature, rose in the 18th century. They studied chemistry, anatomy, botany, astronomy, and electrical. Importantly, they sought practical social reforms. The former Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris was full of experiments. Antoine Lavoisier, a rich Parisian tax officer who loved chemistry, discovered oxygen's role in combustion and established the idea of mass conservation. Lavoisier and his wife Marie, who illustrated and took notes, measured gases and metals with astonishing precision in their home laboratory. He proved that rusting metal gains weight by mixing with airborne oxygen, disproving the phlogiston idea. Such work paved the way for modern chemistry. Lavoisier was a systematic, empirical Enlightenment savant who felt knowledge should advance humanity. Outside the lab, he improved France's gunpowder industry, helping the military, and agricultural research to boost yields. Science historically clashed with religious theology, but by mid-century many clergy were fascinated by it. After the Galileo episode a century earlier, the Church was cautious. Jesuit instructors in France adjusted Cartesian and Newtonian principles. Still, tensions grew. In the 1770s, the Comte de Buffon, the king's naturalist, proposed that the world may be far older than the Bible's 6,000 years. Paris's Faculty of Theology forced him to include a pious disclaimer in his book. Enlightenment science favoured natural explanations above magical ones, contrary to traditional beliefs. Many devout Christians saw scientific findings as proof of God's laws. Medicine and public health were where science and belief intersected most. The introduction of smallpox inoculation, a predecessor to vaccination, was noteworthy. Millions, including royalty, pindurized or scarred by smallpox. After Louis XV died brutally of smallpox in 1774, the new King Louis XVI decided to undergo inoculation, a risky, purposeful infection to bestow immunity. Marie Antoinette supported it. Parisian milliners produced the pouf à l'inoculation, a hairdo with symbols of medicine and victory. A serpent-entwined rod, a rising sun for the king, and an olive branch for peace, to commemorate the royal inoculation's success. Fashion and science were linked. The pouf made inoculation look cool and calm public worries. After the monarchy's high-profile sponsorship, what many considered a dubious, possibly impious activity, deliberately infecting someone, gained legitimacy. It was the moment when empirical knowledge, inoculation success in England and the Ottoman Empire, triumphed superstition. People's veins were filled with Enlightenment notions. Enlightenment science influenced common devices and advances. The elite enjoyed mechanical and scientific exhibitions. Salons had the electrical machines with spinning glass globes that generated static electricity, sparking and raising arm hair. These machines were novelty but important research tools. When American scientist Benjamin Franklin showed lightning was electrical by harnessing it with a kite, Europe was enthralled. France copied the experiment. Franklin was a star in Paris as a revolutionary diplomat and scientist, and his lightning rod creation was praised as a reasoned defence against nature. By the 1780s, even churches were putting lightning rods, possibly recognising that saving a steeple from blowing up was worth it. Some churchmen first opposed them, believing that it was blasphemous to meddle with the artillery of heaven. So science quietly challenged the idea that disasters were divine will by treating them as mechanical issues. No subject was too obscure for the philosophers to probe. Enlightenment thinkers compared doctors' discussions about the heart to a state's circulation of commerce. Philosophy considered classifying human civilizations like naturalists did species. The encyclopedia includes many scientific articles and images, from anatomical diagrams to windmill improvement designs, aiming to gather and disseminate essential knowledge. To catalogue and communicate practical information was an Enlightenment ideal. Knowledge should not be hidden or guild-bound, but shared for the common good. Diderot published on metallurgy, music theory and other subjects because he believed nature and art might liberate minds and enhance life. During this era, the state often linked scientific development to its goals, fostering a culture of enlightened absolutism. Louis XVI and his ministers wanted to use science to improve armaments, maps and agriculture. In the 1760s, the French government supported the enormous meridian voyages to estimate the Earth's form, reflecting Enlightenment curiosity and state pride. The Academy of Sciences researched ways to enhance navigation and chronometers and gave prizes for practical answers. Nutritionists like Parmentier staged meals featuring potato dishes to convince aristocracy it could prevent starvation. To promote potatoes, Parmentier had a field guarded by troops but let peasants steal from it at night. In urban living, the Enlightenment provided new conveniences. Paris's nightly street illumination improved, bringing enlightenment. Public places like the Jardin du Roi, now Jardin des Plantes, offered botanical gardens and a small zoo, representing the era's natural science curriculum. Travelling lecturers demonstrated physics experiments, such as how an air pump could smother a bird in a vacuum jar, ugly, but a dramatic lesson in air. Crowds watched. These shows blurred the lines between education and spectacle. Science was trendy by the 1780s. In clubs, men debated the ideas of Newton and Descartes, while aristocratic women wore small lightning rods as jewellery. The revolutionary idea of rationally evaluating and engineering society also drew inspiration from science. As scientists sought natural rules, philosophers sought social laws. Scientists' skill in describing the world encouraged them to question whether social structures like the monarchy, church, and feudal privileges were logical or historical accidents. Why not redesign a kingdom if a balloon could fly? Science wasn't politically neutral. Some Enlightenment savants faced persecution and challenges. Revolutionaries denounced Lavoisier for being a tax collector in 1794, despite his gunpowder and chemistry advances. Despite his scientific credentials, Lavoisier faced execution when the public turned against experts with links to the Ancien Regime. The Republic has no need of scientists, the judge allegedly declared, rejecting mercy requests. The new administration returned Lavoisier's things to his widow with a note. To the widow of Lavoisier, who was falsely convicted, a year after his execution, acknowledging his innocence and genius, mathematician Lagrange mourned, "It took them only an instant to cut off that head, and 100 years may not suffice to produce another like it." The convergence of Enlightenment science and revolutionary politics was fragile. Science permeated salons, state policies, and street culture in Enlightenment France. It offered control over nature and reflected society. People cooked, healed, travelled, and illuminated their homes differently. It also influenced their thinking by encouraging them to believe that empirical observation and reason could explain and improve the natural and human world. They would put this optimism to the test, but it held significant power. The Montgolfier balloon soaring to cheers at Versailles showed how knowledge may lift humanity. Once a place of gods and mystery, the sky today hosted human achievement. Everything appeared possible currently, and a social and political revolution was about to happen, spurred in part by Enlightenment science's confidence and inquisitive attitude. Toulouse experienced a horrible scene that exemplified the Enlightenment's fight against injustice in 1762. The cruel wheel punishment sentenced Protestant merchant Jean Calas to death for the murder of his son, who was reportedly converting to Catholicism. Calas claimed innocence, but anti-Protestant sentiment decided his fate. He suffered and maintained his innocence until death. Voltaire learned about this injustice at his Ferney house. The famous philosopher was outraged. I believe it's in everyone's interest to study this topic, which some may consider the apogee of fanaticism. Voltaire wrote, "To ignore such a thing is to abandon humanity." Voltaire pursued Calas's vindication and the diligent judge's prosecution. He wrote to powerful people, authored a treatise on tolerance, 1763, and stirred popular support for religious freedom. After years of struggle, Voltaire succeeded. In 1765, the King's Council in Paris overturned Calas's sentence and exonerated him posthumously. This victory of reason over bias was applauded by Europe and the age Voltaire. The Calas scandal proved that the monarchs could be swayed to right or wrong, advancing Enlightenment religious tolerance and legislative change. Voltaire's Écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing, inspired the philosophes, Liger-Bigotry superstition, and priests' misuse of authority were his concerns, not religion itself. Numerous examples enraged the philosophy. 1766 saw the execution of 19-year-old aristocrat Chevalier de la Barre for impiety for not removing his hat during a religious procession and defacing a crucifix. The authorities fastened Voltaire's philosophical dictionary to La Barre's burning body, blaming Enlightenment principles for teenage irreverence. Voltaire, outraged at La Barre's execution, wrote harshly about the cruelty and stupidity of it. These events led philosophes to strengthen their attacks on the Catholic Church and the absolute monarchy with its nobility as oppressors. Enlightenment ideas held the monarchy and religion accountable to reason, justice, and human rights. In the 70s, old regime criticism, previously nuanced and typically articulated through satire or foreign tales, became bolder. Montesquieu questioned absolute monarchy by praising England's equilibrium. Some went further. Rousseau's Social Contract, 1762, opens with the bold claim, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," attacking royal and noble privileges. Rousseau believed that sovereignty was with the people, that laws should represent the public will, and that aristocratic titles were illogical. Secret copies of the banned and destroyed book disseminated its ideas quickly. In later works, Diderot focused on colonialism and slavery and suggested that oppressed people should rise up. Raynal and Diderot's popular History of the Two Indies predicts a slave insurrection and the fall of European authority overseas. That conversation exploded. The French crown's Spamdud censors tried to crush it, but they merely pushed it underground, where it became more appealing. Not all Enlightenment figures were radicals. Many favoured enlightened despotism, which held that a wise and sensible king could reform from power. Voltaire courted Frederick the Great of Prussia and praised Emperor Joseph II of Austria for religious toleration and serfdom reform. Enlightenment influenced French ministers and nobility included Turgot, who tried to deregulate grain trade and abolish forced labour, and the Marquis de Condorcet, who promoted educational and judicial reforms in aristocratic circles. Britannica.com, Britannica.com. These men attempted internal system reform. In 1780, mild-mannered Louis XVI prohibited torture and interrogations, inspired by Cesare Beccaria's Enlightenment essay on crimes and punishments. By providing Protestants civil rights in 1787, he advocated immunization and religious tolerance. The monarchy often failed and faced opposition from existing interests. Nobles resisted Turgot's reforms, dismissing him. The church leadership actively opposed privilege reduction. The French Catholic Church was a key Enlightenment target. The church had long ruled education, literature, and dissenters with immense great riches. Philosophers, mostly deists or agnostics, denounced church persecution. Voltaire opposed intolerance, like the Calas scandal, to humble the church. Candide, his satirical tale, attacked religious hypocrisy and other flaws. In Cannibals, Diderot subtly mocked European religious communion by comparing Pacific Islander customs to European religious communion. Baron de Holbach's system of nature atheism depicts priests as deceptive characters who use hell to subjugate people. The words were provocative. Toulouse experienced a horrible scene that exemplified the Enlightenment's fight against injustice in 1762. The cruel wheel punishment sentenced Protestant merchant Jean Calas to death for the murder of his son, who was reportedly converting to Catholicism. Calas claimed innocence, but anti-Protestant sentiment decided his fate. He suffered and maintained his innocence until death. Voltaire learned about this injustice at his Ferney house. The famous philosopher was outraged. I believe it's in everyone's interest to study this topic, which some may consider the apogee of fanaticism. Voltaire wrote, "To ignore such a thing is to abandon humanity." Voltaire pursued Calas's vindication and the diligent judge's prosecution. He wrote to powerful people, authored a treatise on tolerance, 1763, and stirred popular support for religious freedom. After years of struggle, Voltaire succeeded. In 1765, the King's Council in Paris overturned Calas's sentence and exonerated him posthumously. This victory of reason over bias was applauded by Europe and the age of Voltaire. The Calas scandal proved that the monarchs could be swayed to right or wrong, advancing Enlightenment religious tolerance and legislative change. Voltaire's Écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing, inspired the philosophes. Religio-bigotry, superstition, and priests' misuse of authority were his concerns, not religion itself. Numerous examples enraged the philosophie. 1766 saw the execution of 19-year-old aristocrat Chevalier de la Barre for impiety for not removing his hat during a religious procession and defacing a crucifix. The authorities fastened Voltaire's philosophical dictionary to La Barre's burning body, blaming Enlightenment principles for teenage irreverence. Voltaire, outraged at La Barre's execution, wrote harshly about the cruelty and stupidity of it. These events led philosophes to strengthen their attacks on the Catholic Church and the absolute monarchy with its nobility as oppressors. Enlightenment ideas held the monarchy and religion accountable to reason, justice, and human rights. In the 70s, old regime criticism, previously nuanced and typically articulated through satire or foreign tales, became bolder. Montesquieu questioned absolute monarchy by praising England's equilibrium. Some went further. Rousseau's Social Contract, 1762, opens with the bold claim, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," attacking royal and noble privileges. Rousseau believed that sovereignty was with the people, that laws should represent the public will, and that aristocratic titles were illogical. Secret copies of the banned and destroyed book disseminated its ideas quickly. In later works, Diderot focused on colonialism and slavery and suggested that oppressed people should rise up. Raynal and Diderot's popular History of the Two Indies predicts a slave insurrection and the fall of European authority overseas. That conversation exploded. The French crown Spamdud censors tried to crush it, but they merely pushed it underground, where it became more appealing. Not all Enlightenment figures were radicals. Many favoured enlightened despotism, which held that a wise and sensible king could reform from power. Voltaire courted Frederick the Great of Prussia and praised Emperor Joseph II of Austria for religious toleration and serfdom reform. Enlightenment influenced French ministers and nobility included Turgot, who tried to deregulate grain trade and abolish forced labour, and the Marquis de Condorcet, who promoted educational and judicial reforms in aristocratic circles. Britannica.com, Britannica.com. These men attempted internal system reform. In 1780, mild-mannered Louis XVI prohibited torture and interrogations, inspired by Cesare Beccaria's Enlightenment essay on crimes and punishments. By providing Protestants civil rights in 1787, he advocated immunization and religious tolerance. The monarchy often failed and faced opposition from existing interests. Nobles resisted Turgot's reforms, dismissing him. The church leadership actively opposed privilege reduction. The French Catholic Church was a key Enlightenment target. The church had long ruled education, literature, and dissenters with immense great riches. Philosophers, mostly deists or agnostics, denounced church persecution. Voltaire opposed intolerance, like the Calas scandal, to humble the church. Candide, his satirical tale, attacked religious hypocrisy and other flaws. In Cannibals, Diderot subtly mocked European religious communion by comparing Pacific Islander customs to European religious communion. Baron de Holbach's system of nature atheism depicts priests as deceptive characters who use hell to subjugate people. The words were provocative. The mathematician, philosopher, and liberal nobleman Marquis de Condorcet died in a dismal Bourg-la-Reine jail cell in August of 1794. He fled from the extremist Jacobin regime that called him a traitor. Condorcet, who championed human rights, slavery abolition, and women's suffrage, almost alone among his peers, was now a victim of the revolution he supported. His lifeless body was uncovered by guards. He may have died from disease and exhaustion or from poison he hid when the guillotine approached. The terror's gloom killed one of the Enlightenment's brightest lights. His demise typified the tragic irony that befell many Enlightenment luminaries during the revolutionary storm. Their promised progress had turned on them. As previously mentioned, Lavoisier faced execution despite his claims that his scientific efforts benefited the nation. Madame Geoffrin's daughter saw her salon acquaintances scattered, some executed, as genteel reform conversations gave way to mobs. Even after their deaths in 1793, Voltaire and Rousseau were disputed by revolutionaries. with radicals favouring Rousseau's egalitarianism and moderates Voltaire's tolerance. The Enlightenment inspired the Revolution, but the Revolution tested it. The French Revolution both upheld and undermined Enlightenment values. On one hand, it formalised many philosophers' essential ideas. Based on Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau and Locke, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, advocated freedom of speech and religion, equality before the law, and the right to resist injustice. The philosopher's dream of a meritocratic society was realised on August 1789, when feudal privileges and tithes were abolished in one night. The Constitution of 1791 established a constitutional monarchy with a Montesquieu-like division of powers. The Revolution fulfilled Voltaire's calls for toleration by seizing church property in 1790 and awarding full citizenship to Protestants and Jews in 1791. When Louis XVI was guillotined in 1793, Rousseau's vision of popular sovereignty, the people's will above divine right kingship, was most clearly confirmed. However, the Revolution's violent, illiberal turn troubled many. The Enlightenment sought to replace tyranny with reasoned conversation, not crowd or one-party power. The Committee of Public Safety murdered thousands of enemies of the Revolution during the Reign of Terror, 1793-4, a terrible inversion of Enlightenment ideas. Reason gave way to another frenzy. Under Robespierre, the revolutionaries formed a municipal religion of the Supreme Being and held deistic festivals, a guillotine-enforced version of Rousseau's civil religion. People executed under the guise of reason for being aristocrats or moderate republicans would have horrified Voltaire. The terror exposed an Enlightenment contradiction. The confidence in a single truth, rational or ideological, can lead to tyranny. Philosophers like d'Holbach and Helvetius were as intolerant of religious people as atheists. The Revolution showed how abstract enlightenment may become dogmatism. No one shall spread darkness, on pain of death. Many Enlightenment thinkers did not want democracy. Voltaire favoured an enlightened monarch over an uninformed mob. Some intellectuals said early revolutionary assemblies' disarray showed Voltaire was right about the Quenelle rabble. Before his 1784 death, Diderot had become pessimistic, arguing that despotism might only cease when the last monarch was strangled with the last priest's entrails, a dismal hyperbole the revolutionaries half-jokingly repeated. Diderot probably wouldn't have celebrated the 1793 mass guillotining. Philosophers had not solved how to justly implement principles. This gap existed between theory and practice. Enlightenment supporters faced social contradictions. Few addressed women's condition directly, although they promised equality. Though a proponent of democracy, Rousseau believed women should be educated exclusively to please men and stay at home, contrary to Olympe de Gouges and Condorcet, who authored an essay in 1790 advocating for women's political rights. After writing a Declaration of the Rights of Woman, the revolutionary authority guillotined de Gouges. The Enlightenment fraternity had excluded their sisters from universal rights. There was division among Enlightenment views on race and slavery. Some, like Diderot and Condorcet, strongly criticised slavery as against natural law. The 1788 Society of Friends of the Blacks, founded by Enlightenment-influenced men, sought abolition. Others, like Voltaire, criticised the slave trade in the abstract but made racist statements and invested in colonial corporations. Enlightenment, universal human nature battled with pseudoscientific racism, ironically, a consequence of species classification. The revolution abolished slavery in 1794 after a massive slave insurrection in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, but Napoleon reinstalled it. Ideal and reality differed. Relationship between intellect and emotion was another tension. Rousseau noted that humans are not rational, but the Enlightenment praised reason. The revolution showed that passions, anger at injustices, desire for vengeance, hope for glory, drive events more than academic treatises. Romanticism, a 19th century counterattack, accused the Enlightenment of disregarding the heart, tradition and faith. Edmund Burke in England and Joseph de Maistre in France held the philosophes, unfairly, responsible for the revolution's bloodshed by unmooring society from traditional institutions. They said that the Enlightenment's abstract reasoning had dissolved authority and led to chaos and Napoleon's rule. While this view is debatable, by the early 1800s, the Enlightenment was hailed for the Declaration of Rights and scientific advancement, but also accused of revolution. Long-term, the French Enlightenment left a deep and mostly good influence. It inspired the French, American, and later independence movements worldwide. Many Enlightenment goals were achieved in the 19th century, including the abolition of slavery in European empires, France in 1848, Britain 1833, the spread of public education, the rise of secular states and the reduction of church temporal power, the gradual and uneven expansion of suffrage, and the advancement of science and technology without dogma. The 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on Enlightenment ideas. Today we echo Voltaire's calls for press and conscience freedom. Governments cite Montesquieu when creating checks and balances. When protesters invoke the will of the people, Rousseau is followed. However, the Enlightenment left more uncertain legacies. The scientific revolution and industrial society were fueled by reason, but romantics and later existentialists criticised it for promoting technocracy and soulless rationality. Westerners defended imperialism as bringing civilization, an attitude oddly at conflict with the Enlightenment's empathy, but facilitated by its aim. Enlightenment secularism allowed diversity to develop, but also left a spiritual hole that 19th and 20th century ideologies and nationalisms strove to fill, not always for the better. After Napoleon's collapse in 1815, France's monarchy re-established church dominance and conservative tendencies. Intellectual life had changed, thus the genie could not be put back. French politics alternated between liberal and conservative in the mid-19th century, but Enlightenment ideas set the standard. Even conservatives had to justify themselves in terms of logical government and national interest, not divine authority. France will officially divorce church and state in 1905, fulfilling the philosophes' aim of a secular republic based on liberté, égalité, fraternité. Enlightenment principles filtered through revolutionary experience. The French Enlightenment did not finish neatly in 1789. The revolution was chaotic and its aftermath complicated. Perhaps that emphasises a last Enlightenment lesson. The movement always understood that human affairs are imperfect and progress zigzags. Diderot observed, "Passions are the only orators that always persuade, conceding that reason doesn't control the world." Later in life, Voltaire tempered his mockery with appeals for steady improvement, not utopia. Even radical Rousseau cautioned that abrupt upheaval could lead to harsher despotism. Many Enlightenment thinkers realised that Enlightenment would be a long-term, tense project. Thus the Enlightenment's twilight transformed rather than ended. People called themselves ideologues or intellectuals instead of philosophes in the 19th century, but they inherited the Enlightenment's realm. Questioning authority, demanding reasoned answers, and claiming individual dignity became entrenched in Western civilization. When we read Voltaire's witty, courageous writings, Rousseau's profound challenges, Diderot's encyclopedic labours, or Condorcet's prescient humanism, we are reminded of the Enlightenment's very human story. Salon gatherings and clandestine pamphlets, friendships and feuds, and people risking prison for a pamphlet or exile for a principle. Ideas could overthrow thrones in that age. Its legacy lives on every time an informed public holds a tyrant accountable. A youngster is taught science without superstition, various individuals sit down to talk and debate rather than fight, and we choose light over darkness. The French Enlightenment was truly a turning point in human history.
Picture yourself settling into a comfortable chair by a crackling fire, maybe with a warm cup of tea steaming beside you. Tonight, we're going to take a gentle journey back through time, to an era when castles dotted the landscape like stone flowers, and family trees looked more like family wreaths. You're about to discover how medieval Europe's obsession with keeping bloodlines pure created some of the most entertainingly twisted family dynamics in human history. Let's start in the year 1247 in a castle somewhere in what we'd now call France. You're walking through the wonderful hall and something feels off. Not scary off, mind you, just peculiar. Every portrait lining the wall seems to feature the same prominent nose, the same slightly drooping eyelid, and the same unfortunate chin that juts forward like a castle's drawbridge, permanently stuck halfway down. It's as if one person posed for every family portrait across 3 centuries, just changing their clothes and hairstyles to keep things intriguing. The culprit wasn't artistic laziness or a painter with limited imagination. This was the Habsburg jaw. Though the Habsburgs hadn't quite perfected their signature look yet, medieval nobility had discovered what they thought was the perfect solution to a very real problem. How do you keep your wealth, power, and bloodline secure when you're surrounded by ambitious neighbours who'd love nothing more than to marry into your fortune and claim a piece of your kingdom? The answer seemed obvious at the time. You marry your cousin, and if that works out well, maybe your children will marry their cousins too. After all, who better to trust with your family's future than, well, your family? It was like keeping your money in a family-owned bank, except the currency was DNA, and the interest rates were absolutely terrible. You see, medieval Europe operated on a simple principle that would make modern relationship counsellors weep into their tissues. Blood was thicker than water, and the thicker, the better. Kings and queens looked at their family trees and thought, why let all these perfectly noble bloodlines wander off into other families when we could just loop them back around? It was a time when recycling was not only fashionable, but also a means of creating truly memorable genetic combinations, rather than preserving the environment. The Church, despite its medieval origins, attempted to curb this enthusiasm. Before marriage became a taboo, they established rules about how closely related you could be. But here's where it becomes delightfully absurd. These same nobles who couldn't marry their first cousins would spend fortunes on papal dispensations, basically permission slips from the Pope, to marry their second cousins instead. It was akin to obtaining a hall pass to circumvent the rules, but the restrictions were based on genetics, and the cost of the hall pass surpassed the cost of most people's castles. Imagine being a medieval wedding planner in those days. Instead of worrying about seating charts based on divorces or political disagreements, you would be frantically sketching family trees to ensure that the bride and groom weren't accidentally related as uncle and niece. Let us examine the lineage through your great-grandmother's second marriage. Oh dear, it appears you're related in 3 distinct ways. Should we prioritise the closest relationship or the most recent one for the announcement? Should we go with the closest relationship or the most recent one for the announcement? The irony, of course, was delicious. These families were so concerned with keeping their bloodlines pure that they kept making them increasingly concentrated, like reducing a sauce until it becomes too intense for anyone to actually enjoy. What started as an attempt to preserve noble characteristics ended up creating some truly unique family reunions where everyone genuinely did look like distant relatives, because they were. You're still in that castle, and now you're looking more closely at those portraits. The resemblance isn't just striking, it's almost supernatural. 3-year-old Lord Timothy has the same weak chin as his great-great-grandfather, and Lady Margaret's distinctive nose appears to have been passed down with the precision of a medieval mason's measurements. This isn't mere coincidence, it's the result of your gene pool merging into a mere puddle. Let's wander over to medieval Spain, where the situation was getting particularly intriguing. Picture yourself as a visiting dignitary attending a royal wedding. You're handed a programme that includes a family tree to help you understand how the bride and groom are related. You unfold it, expecting something straightforward, and instead find what looks like a diagram for a very confused electrical circuit. The bride is the groom's second cousin through his mother's side, but also his third cousin through his father's side, and if you follow this dotted line here, technically his step-aunt through a previous marriage that was annulled, but the relationship somehow still counts. Medieval record keepers developed impressive skills at diplomatic language. Instead of writing "married his cousin," they'd craft elaborate phrases like "united in holy matrimony with his beloved kinswoman," or "joined with one of compatible noble bearing and familiar bloodline." It was like medieval spin control, making family reunions sound like diplomatic summits. The mathematics of medieval marriage were staggering. In some royal families, you could trace 7 different paths connecting any husband and wife. It wasn't just that everyone was related, it was that everyone was related in multiple, overlapping ways. Your spouse might simultaneously be your second cousin, third cousin once removed, and fourth cousin twice removed. Family gatherings must have required name tags, not just with names, but with relationship flowcharts. Consider the case of poor Charles II of Spain, who appears later in our story. By the time he was born, his family tree had been so thoroughly tangled that his parents were more closely related than typical siblings. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than what you'd encounter in laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic uniformity. The man's jaw protruded so far forward that he couldn't chew properly, and his tongue was so large that his speech was barely intelligible. Yet somehow, the man was considered the pinnacle of royal breeding. Medieval physicians, bless their well-meaning hearts, had no idea what was happening. They developed elaborate theories about noble blood and refined humours to explain why royal families developed such distinctive characteristics. When little Prince Ferdinand was born, with the family's signature jutting jaw, physicians would nod sagely and explain that the trait demonstrated the purity of his noble essence. It was like having a genetic lottery where all the winning numbers were the same, but everyone convinced themselves that these traits proved they were lucky. The tragic comedy reached its peak when families would celebrate these distinctive features as proof of their superiority. That prominent forehead wasn't a sign of genetic bottlenecking. It was evidence of noble bearing. Rather than being the product of chromosomal confusion, those slightly crossed eyes were a sign of royal reflection. Medieval courts developed an entire aesthetic around what were essentially genetic accidents, turning medical textbook examples into fashion statements. You can imagine the portrait artists of the time developing very diplomatic techniques. How do you depict a person whose features, concentrated through generations of inbreeding, resemble a caricature of nobility? The answer was to lean into it, creating artistic styles that made everyone look slightly surreal, as if the distortions were intentional artistic choices rather than unavoidable biological realities. You're now sitting in on a medieval council meeting, and the discussion isn't about taxes or territorial disputes. It's about marriage prospects for the young prince. The advisors have spread a massive chart across the oak table, and they're using coloured threads to trace family connections like they're planning a military campaign. In a way, they are. Medieval marriage wasn't romance, it was strategic alliance building with a side of genetic roulette. Every union was a treaty, every child a potential diplomatic asset, and every family tree a battle map showing who controlled what bloodlines. You watch as the advisors debate the merits of various cousins, like they're discussing trade routes or fortress locations. The Duke's daughter brings strong claims to 3 counties, one advisor notes, moving a blue thread across the chart. However, she's also the prince's second cousin, through both maternal and paternal lines. Another advisor responds, yes, but consider the consolidation benefits. Their children would have undisputed claims to all territories involved. It was like medieval monopoly, except instead of buying properties, they were collecting relatives. The church's prohibition on close relative marriages created an entire industry of genealogical detective work. Families employed specialists whose only job was to trace bloodlines and identify the most distant possible relatives who still brought useful political connections. These medieval relationship consultants functioned similarly to modern dating app algorithms, analysing compatibility based on factors such as territorial holdings, political alliances, and genetic distance, albeit with a limited understanding of the latter. Papal dispensations became medieval Europe's most expensive permission slips. Want to marry your first cousin? That'll be a cathedral's worth of gold, please. Second cousin? Although it remains expensive, it is still within reach. The Pope's office developed an elaborate sliding scale based on how closely related the happy couple were. It was like paying extra fees for premium relationship violations, and business was booming. Picture yourself as a young noble in this system. Your marriage prospects weren't determined by personality compatibility or shared interests. They were calculated based on territorial maps and bloodline charts. Your ideal spouse was someone who was related closely enough to keep the family wealth concentrated, but distantly enough to avoid needing the most expensive papal dispensation. Romance was finding someone you were only related to in 2 or 3 ways instead of 7. The paperwork alone was staggering. Medieval marriage contracts read like international treaties, complete with genealogical appendices, territorial transfer agreements, and detailed succession plans. A simple "I do" required documentation that would make modern divorce lawyers weep with joy. Couples needed to prove their bloodlines, document their dispensations, and provide certified family trees going back generations. Some families got creative with their relationship mathematics. If you couldn't locate a suitably distant relative who brought favourable political connections, you could adopt someone into the family first, then arrange a marriage. It was like medieval relationship hacking, creating artificial family connections to justify strategic unions, while still maintaining the appearance of keeping bloodlines pure. The truly ambitious families played long-term genetic chess, arranging marriages not just for immediate political gain, but to set up advantageous relationships for their grandchildren. They'd marry siblings into different branches of target families, creating multiple connection points for future generations. It was family planning with a 30-year strategic horizon, except the strategy was based on a medieval understanding of genetics, which is to say, no understanding at all. Medieval courts developed elaborate etiquette around acknowledging these complex relationships. You couldn't just introduce your spouse as my wife, you needed to specify my beloved wife and second cousin once removed through the Burgundian line. It was like medieval name tags needed footnotes, and every social gathering required a genealogist on standby to sort out who could sit next to whom without creating awkward family dynamics. You've moved from the council chamber to the castle nursery, where things get both more heartwarming and more concerning. Medieval child rearing in noble families was like running a very exclusive, very expensive laboratory experiment in genetic concentration, except nobody realised they were conducting an experiment. Picture the castle's nursery wing, where little Lord Geoffrey is learning to walk with the distinctive family gait, a slight rolling motion that's been passed down for 6 generations. His sisters are practising their curtsying with the family's characteristic head tilt, which developed because several generations of inbreeding created inner ear issues that affected balance. What looks like refined noble bearing is actually adaptive behaviour around genetic quirks. Medieval tutors faced unique challenges that would stump modern educators. How do you instruct children in mathematics when their family's genetic concentration has resulted in learning disabilities that will remain unexplained for another 5 centuries? The solution was to assume that noble children learned differently because they were naturally superior, not because cousin marriage had created some interesting neurological variations. The castle physicians developed specialised medical knowledge that was simultaneously impressive and completely wrong. They could accurately describe the symptoms of what we now know as genetic disorders, but their explanations were fascinating works of creative fiction. That distinctive Habsburg jaw. The family's noble blood was so pure that ordinary facial structures couldn't contain it. Those vision problems are affecting multiple family members. Noble eyes evidently possess a refinement that surpasses common sight. You're observing the children's daily lessons, and there is something both poignant and absurd about their education. Little Lady Catherine is learning heraldry, memorising coats of arms that represent the same few families arranged in slightly different combinations across centuries. Her brother is studying genealogy, which in their family requires charts that look like abstract art projects. Their family tree has so many interconnecting branches that tracing any lineage looks like following a drunken spider's web. Medieval noble children developed remarkable skills at diplomatic relationship navigation that would impress modern social workers. By age 8, they could explain how they were related to visiting dignitaries in 3 different ways in which relationship took precedence in which social situations. Well, technically, Lord Roderick is my great-uncle through marriage, but also my second cousin by blood, so I should address him using the cousin protocols unless grandmother is present, in which case the uncle relationship takes precedence because it comes through her side of the family. The education system adapted effectively to these genetic realities, although this adaptation was not intentional. When multiple children in the same family struggle with similar learning challenges, medieval educators assumed the evidence proved that noble minds worked on higher planes than common intellects. They developed teaching methods that were effective for children with learning disabilities, although they believed they were creating advanced curricula intended for superior noble minds. Castle life developed around accommodating what we now recognise as the results of genetic concentration. Meals were prepared in ways that made them easier for family members with jaw problems to eat. Lighting was arranged to help relatives with vision issues navigate safely. Family members who struggled with balance or coordination were helped by the placement of the furniture. These weren't recognised as medical accommodations, they were just the way noble households operated. The children's play activities were charmingly adapted to their circumstances. Tag became a more contemplative game when several players had coordination issues. Hide and seek worked differently when some children had vision problems that made hiding easier but seeking harder. The players developed elaborate group activities that unintentionally provided excellent social therapy for children dealing with various genetic quirks, although everyone assumed they were merely inventing more refined forms of noble entertainment. Medieval toy makers created special playthings for noble children that were actually therapeutic devices in disguise. Puzzles designed to help with fine motor skills were presented as intelligence challenges for superior minds. Games that provided speech therapy were marketed as refinement exercises for noble discourse. It was accidental occupational therapy disguised as luxury entertainment, and it worked remarkably well. You're now in the magnificent dining hall during a feast, and the seating arrangement looks like it was planned by someone with a mathematics degree and a deep understanding of medieval social anxiety. The head table isn't just organised by rank, it's a careful dance around genetic relationships, political alliances, and the complex etiquette of acknowledging multiple forms of family connection simultaneously. Medieval dinner conversation in noble households required skills that would challenge modern diplomats. When everyone at the table had overlapping, sometimes contradictory relationships with each other, you couldn't simply engage in casual conversation about the weather. When your father was also your dinner companion's second cousin, brother-in-law, and political rival, the question, "How's your father?" took on a significant weight. The entertainment during these feasts adapted to the unique characteristics of inbred nobility in ways that were both considerate and completely unconscious. Minstrels learned to sing more slowly and clearly because several generations of genetic concentration had created hearing and processing issues in many noble families. They believed they were creating more refined and contemplative musical styles. In reality, they were actually developing accommodations for medieval accessibility. You're observing the dinner conversation, and it's like watching a very polite, very complex form of verbal gymnastics. When Lord Baldwin mentions his recent marriage, 3 other people at the table have to navigate the fact that his new wife is their relative in different ways. The conversation becomes a careful dance around relationship acknowledgements. Congratulations on your union with our dear cousin. Well, she's my cousin through the maternal line, but I believe she's your cousin through marriage, Lord Edmund? Medieval etiquette books developed increasingly complex rules for these situations, though they didn't quite understand why such rules were necessary. There were specific protocols for addressing relatives who outranked you, relatives who outranked you in some family lines but not others, and relatives whose relationship to you changed depending on which ancestor you traced your connection through. It was like medieval Robert's Rules of Order, but for genetic complexity. The castle's record keepers had evolved into part genealogist, part diplomat, and part social worker. They maintained massive charts tracking not just family relationships, but the emotional and political implications of those relationships. When planning seating arrangements, they had to consider not just who was related to whom, but which relationships were currently being emphasised for political reasons and which were being diplomatically ignored. Medieval gift-giving became an art form of relationship acknowledgement that would confuse modern etiquette experts. Wedding presents had to acknowledge the couple's relationship to the giver in multiple ways. You might present them something as their cousin, something else as their political ally, and a third item acknowledging their connection through a different family line. It was like giving layered presents that told the story of your family's genetic history. The dinner entertainment often included genealogical performances that were part history lesson and part family therapy. Bards would recite family lineages, but they had to carefully navigate a complicated web of relationships without accidentally highlighting uncomfortable genetic concentrations. It was storytelling that required both poetic skill and diplomatic immunity. You noticed that conversations naturally developed careful euphemisms around the realities of their genetic situation. Instead of saying inbreeding, they talked about preserving noble bloodlines. Rather than mentioning genetic problems, they discussed the refined nature of noble constitutions. They developed an entire vocabulary that acknowledged their reality without quite admitting what was happening. Medieval feasts became elaborate social rituals that helped families navigate their genetic complexity with dignity and grace. The formal structure of these events provided a framework for managing relationships that were too complicated for casual interaction. Everyone knew their role, their place, and which aspects of their multiple family connections to emphasise in what contexts. It was like dinner theatre where everyone was both performer and audience, and the script was written by generations of genetic mathematics. You're now visiting the castle's medical wing, where medieval physicians are performing intellectual gymnastics that would impress modern creative writing teachers. These dedicated healers are examining patients whose genetic conditions won't be properly understood for centuries, and they're coming up with explanations that are fascinating examples of medieval medical imagination. Picture yourself observing a consultation between the court physician and young Lord Richard, whose Habsburg jaw has progressed to the point where speaking clearly requires considerable effort. The doctor, stroking his beard thoughtfully, explains that this distinctive facial structure is actually evidence of noble blood being so refined that it requires more space to flow properly through the facial region. It's like medieval medical fiction, except everyone believes it's scientific fact. Medieval medical texts from noble courts read like fantasy novels written by people who had genuine sympathy for their patients but absolutely no understanding of genetics. They describe noble melancholy, depression from genetic factors, refined constitutions, autoimmune issues from inbreeding, and superior sensitivities, neurological problems from genetic concentration. These physicians were creating medical mythology in real time, and their patients were grateful for explanations that preserved their dignity. The treatments developed for noble families were often surprisingly effective, although the doctors did not understand the reasons behind this effectiveness. When treating noble digestive refinement, intestinal problems from genetic factors, physicians prescribed digestible foods and small frequent meals. When addressing aristocratic visual sensitivity, eye problems from inbreeding, they recommended better lighting and reduced eye strain. They were accidentally providing excellent medical care while completely misunderstanding the underlying conditions. You're watching a particularly creative diagnostic session where the physician is examining Lady Eleanor, whose balance problems and fine motor difficulties are being explained as signs that her noble spirit is too refined for ordinary physical coordination. Careful exercise, adaptive equipment masquerading as luxury items, and a modified daily routine constitute the prescribed treatment, which is actually perfect physical therapy. It's accidental medicine that works despite being based on completely wrong assumptions. Medieval apothecaries developed special preparations for noble families that were essentially early pharmaceuticals for genetic conditions, though they thought they were creating luxury wellness products. Tonics for noble nervousness contained ingredients that we now know help with anxiety disorders. Preparations for aristocratic digestive delicacy included herbs that helped with metabolic issues. They were practicing evidence-based medicine while thinking they were providing premium lifestyle products. The most creative medical theories emerged around reproductive health in noble families. Physicians noticed that noble couples often had difficulty conceiving healthy children, genetic compatibility issues, but they explained these factors as evidence that noble reproduction was naturally more selective and refined than common breeding. They developed fertility treatments that were actually quite sophisticated, though their theoretical explanations read like medieval romance novels. Court physicians became experts at diplomatic medicine, treating real conditions while providing explanations that preserved their patients' social status and self-image. When addressing the learning difficulties common in inbred noble children, they'd explain that noble minds simply operated on different, more sophisticated levels than ordinary intellects. They'd prescribe educational modifications while framing them as advanced noble training techniques. Medieval medical records from noble households reveal physicians who were genuinely caring and effective, despite working with completely inaccurate theoretical frameworks. They documented symptoms with remarkable precision, developed innovative treatments through careful observation, and created support systems for their patients that addressed both medical and social needs. They were practicing compassionate medicine while creating elaborate fictional explanations for what they were treating. The pharmaceutical preparations created for noble families often contained ingredients that modern medicine recognizes as genuinely advantageous for genetic conditions. Medieval physicians, through careful observation and trial and error, identified herbs and compounds that addressed symptoms they couldn't properly explain. They were conducting successful medical research while thinking they were just creating more refined versions of common remedies. You're in a castle courtyard in the late Middle Ages, watching the sun set on a time when people were doing genetic experiments without even knowing it. European noble families are beginning to see that they may need to change their marriage customs, but they don't know why. The epiphany came slowly, like the sun rising over the European nobility. Families started to see that their refined bloodlines were making kids that had a harder time with everyday activities. The noble houses that were the most pure were having the hardest time having healthy heirs. Even the most innovative medical hypotheses were having a difficult time explaining away trends that were becoming impossible to ignore. You're watching a family council meeting where the advisors are talking about things that would have been unimaginable 100 years ago. They're saying that the family might want to think about making marriage alliances with cousins who are a little more distant, not because there's anything wrong with the way they're doing things now, but because it might be politically smart to widen their circle of possible brides. It's like witnessing folks find fire while acting like they were merely attempting to make their home warmer. The church started to change its rules about how to distribute out money, but it didn't say that the old rules had been bad. The Pope's offices began to encourage marriages between families that had never been connected before. They framed this as a way to bring Christians together, not as a way to deal with genetic issues. It was a change in diplomatic policy that met medical goals without admitting medical grounds. In the Middle Ages, record keeping slowly changed from focusing on genetic purity to focusing on the political and territorial benefits of marriage. Family histories began to focus more on the strategic benefits of marriages and less on the genetic ties between spouses. It was like watching medieval spin control change in real time to address a public relations issue that wouldn't be fully understood for hundreds of years. The transition wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual recognition that survival required some adjustments to traditional practices. Noble families began sending their children to courts in different regions, creating opportunities for marriages that were politically advantageous but genetically beneficial, though nobody used that second term yet. It was like accidentally discovering hybrid vigour while thinking you were just improving your diplomatic connections. You're witnessing the beginning of the end of an era when European nobility conducted one of history's largest unintentional genetic experiments. Families that had spent centuries perfecting the art of marrying within increasingly narrow circles began the slow process of expanding their horizons, though they framed it as political strategy rather than genetic necessity. Medieval physicians began developing new theories that accidentally encouraged genetic diversity while maintaining the fiction that noble blood was naturally superior. They started suggesting that occasionally introducing foreign noble essences could strengthen and refine existing bloodlines. It was like recommending genetic diversity while pretending it was luxury bloodline enhancement. The most successful noble families of the later medieval period were those who mastered the art of balancing genetic health with political advantage, though they didn't think about it in those terms. They found ways to marry outside their immediate family circles while maintaining the social fiction that they were preserving noble bloodline purity. It was diplomatic genetics practiced by people who didn't know genetics existed. As you watch this medieval sunset, you're witnessing the end of Europe's great experiment in genetic concentration. The noble families who survived and thrived were those who learned to value political alliance over bloodline purity, even if they never quite admitted that's what they were doing. They'd discovered that the strongest bloodlines were actually the most diverse ones, though they'd never used those words to describe their new marriage strategies. The legacy of medieval inbreeding lives on in European royal portraits, where you can still trace the distinctive features that travelled through centuries of concentrated bloodlines. Those portraits tell the story of families who loved each other enough to make terrible genetic decisions, and who were wise enough, eventually, to quietly change course without admitting they'd made mistakes. It's a story of human adaptability, medieval resilience, and the surprising power of accidental wisdom to correct even the most well-intentioned errors. And so, as our medieval tale draws to a close, you can rest easy knowing that even the most tangled family trees eventually find ways to grow new branches, and that sometimes the best solutions come from people who solve problems they don't fully understand in ways they never quite intended.
Picture this, you're complaining about your house being 68 degrees instead of 72, maybe grumbling as you reach for that extra blanket. Now imagine it's 1942, you're somewhere in Eastern Europe, and the thermometer has given up trying to measure temperatures that would make a penguin reconsider its life choices. Welcome to the world where winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively trying to kill you. You see, when World War II rolled around, nobody really thought much about the weather. Sure, Napoleon had a minor mishap with the Russian winter in 1812, but that was long ago, right? Modern armies had modern equipment. They had plans, they had confidence. They had no idea how creative you had to be when Jack Frost joined the other team. The thing about military planning is that it's a lot like packing for a vacation. You think you know what you'll need. You make your lists, you feel prepared, and then you arrive to discover you've brought sandals to a blizzard. Except in this case, the consequences of poor packing weren't just uncomfortable, they were potentially fatal. When the first brutal winter hit the European theatre, soldiers discovered something that would make even the most seasoned outdoorsman nervous. The cold wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that turns your breath into icicles mid-sentence, that makes metal so brittle it snaps like a pretzel, and that transforms simple tasks like loading a rifle into a finger-numbing exercise in futility. But here's where the story gets intriguing and where you start to see the remarkable ingenuity of people who refuse to let Mother Nature have the last word. When confronted with temperatures so low as to freeze antifreeze, individuals not only endure, but also innovate. You master improvisation, acquire a PhD in adaptability, and become a professor of whatever works. The first lesson these soldiers learned was that the enemy wasn't always wearing a uniform. Occasionally the enemy was invisible, creeping through tent flaps and uniform seams, turning their breath against them, and making every night a battle for survival. The cold became a third party in the conflict, impartial in its cruelty, affecting everyone equally, regardless of which side they were fighting for. Think about your worst camping experience. Maybe that time the air mattress deflated, or when you forgot to pack enough warm clothes. Imagine multiplying that discomfort by approximately 1,000, adding the constant threat of enemy action, and adding the responsibility of ensuring the functionality of your equipment and the survival of your fellow soldiers. And you'll begin to understand the situation. What's remarkable isn't just that these soldiers survived, it's how they turned survival into an art form. They became meteorologists without weather apps, engineers without blueprints, and inventors without patents. Every night became a laboratory for testing new theories about heat retention. Every morning brought lessons in what worked and what left you counting your toes to make sure they were all still there. The standard issue gear quickly proved about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, designed by people who probably tested it in climates as harsh as a suburban backyard in October. Wool uniforms that seemed adequate became insufficient. Boots designed for marching became ice buckets for feet. Tents meant to provide shelter became elaborate ways to concentrate cold air. So what do you do when your equipment fails, your supply lines are stretched thinner than your patience, and the thermometer looks like it's trying to dig to China? You get creative. You start looking at everything around you, not for what it is, but for what it could become. That mess kit isn't just for eating, it's a potential hand warmer. That extra sock isn't just spare clothing, it's insulation for your rifle. That piece of canvas isn't just material. It's the difference between sleeping and freezing. And this is where our story really begins. Not with the grand strategies or the famous battles, but with the quiet moments when ordinary people figured out extraordinary ways to stay alive in conditions that seemed designed to make that impossible. Now, you might think that socks are just socks, those things you lose in the dryer, argue about with your spouse, and occasionally use to dust furniture when nobody's looking. But in the frozen theatres of World War II, socks became currency, lifelines, and the foundation of an entire underground economy that would make Wall Street traders jealous. The first thing you need to understand about feet in sub-zero temperatures is that they're basically traitors. Your body, being the pragmatic organism it is, decides that keeping your core warm is more important than maintaining diplahebus, or in this case under the frostbite. Therefore your feet, along with your fingers, suffer the consequences of frostbite. Trenchfoot became a condition so common that it practically needed its own postal code. Imagine your feet deciding to stage a revolt, swelling up, turning fascinating colours that would make a sunset jealous, and generally make every step feel like walking on broken glass. Now imagine trying to march, run, or fight in that condition. It's like trying to dance ballet in ski boots filled with marbles. This is where the Great Sock Conspiracy began. Soldiers quickly realised that the military's approach to foot care was about as sophisticated as using a hammer to fix a watch. The standard issue socks were fine for parade grounds, but about as useful as chocolate teapots when dealing with months of wet, cold conditions. So they improvised, and their solutions would make modern outdoor gear companies weep with admiration. They learned to layer socks like lasagna, thin silk or cotton against the skin, wool for insulation, and sometimes even paper or cloth strips for extra padding. They discovered that changing socks wasn't just hygiene, it was survival. Dry socks became more valuable than cigarettes, and cigarettes were practically currency. But here's where it gets really creative. When fresh socks were in short supply, which was most of the time, soldiers became textile engineers. They learned to dry wet socks using body heat, tucking them inside their uniforms close to their chest while they slept. Imagine spooning with your laundry, but hey, when it's life or death, dignity takes a back memory seat. They also figured out the ancient art of sock rotation. They would maintain a meticulous record of the socks they had worn, those that were drying and those that were clean, much like a sophisticated filing system. Some soldiers developed elaborate schedules that would make a corporate calendar look simple. Tuesday, wear the grey wool, dry the cotton blend, air out the emergency pair. The really clever ones discovered that newspapers, when available, made excellent sock insulation. They'd wrap their feet in newspaper before putting on socks, creating a makeshift vapour barrier that would make modern hiking gear designers nod with approval. Of course, this led to the amusing situation of soldiers literally having yesterday's news in their boots, but when you're avoiding frostbite, you don't complain about the reading material. Some soldiers took the sock science even further, learning to waterproof their footwear using whatever was available. Candle wax, animal fat, even soap. Anything that could create a barrier between their feet and the elements. They became chemists, testing different combinations and sharing successful formulas like state secrets. The sock trade became so sophisticated that units developed their own internal economies. A pair of dry wool socks could be worth a day's rations. Clean socks served as birthday presents, Christmas gifts, and tokens of friendship. Soldiers would literally give you the socks off their feet, though probably not the ones they were currently wearing. And then there were the ingenious innovations in socks. Some soldiers learned to knit, creating custom toile, socks from unravelled sweaters or salvaged yarn. Others figured out how to repair holes using thread pulled from other garments, essentially performing sock surgery by candlelight. But perhaps the most touching aspect of the Great Sock Conspiracy was how it brought people together. Soldiers would share their foot care knowledge like family recipes, passing down the wisdom of keeping extremities warm from veteran to rookie. They'd help each other check for signs of frostbite, assist with the delicate operation of sock changing in cramped quarters, and share the precious resource of dry footwear. The discussion wasn't just about comfort, though comfort was certainly part of it. The debate was about maintaining the ability to fight, march, and survive. Feet were mission-critical equipment, and socks were the maintenance manual. Every dry sock was a small victory against the cold. Every successful foot care routine was a triumph of human ingenuity over hostile conditions. You know how they say 2 heads are better than 1? Well, in temperatures that could freeze your thoughts mid-think, 2 bodies were definitely better than 1. In freezing conditions, the buddy system evolved from simple military protocol to a delicate survival dance that demanded more coordination than a Broadway musical and more trust than a marriage. Imagine trying to explain to your spouse why you need to share a sleeping bag with your co-worker. Now imagine that sharing a bed isn't just a suggestion, it's the difference between waking up tomorrow and becoming a human popsicle. Welcome to the realm of tactical cuddling, where maintaining personal space has become an expensive luxury. The science behind shared body heat is actually pretty straightforward, though the execution could be hilariously awkward. Your body generates heat, about as much as a 100-watt light bulb when you're just sitting around. In normal conditions, most of that heat just wanders off into the atmosphere like an ungrateful teenager. But when you're trying to survive in conditions that would make an Arctic fox shop for a warmer coat, every BTU becomes precious. Soldiers quickly learned that sharing body heat wasn't just about snuggling up. It was about creating a microclimate, a tiny pocket of livable temperature in the middle of nature's deep freeze. They developed techniques that would make efficiency experts proud. 2 soldiers would zip their sleeping bags together, creating what they called a thermal envelope. Sounds fancy, but it was basically an adult sleeping bag built for 2 chilly people. But here's where it gets tricky, and sometimes hilarious. Sharing body heat requires coordination that would challenge a synchronized swimming team. Who sleeps on which side? How do you arrange arms and legs so that nobody's circulation gets cut off? What happens when one person needs to get up in the middle of the night? These became crucial tactical decisions that could mean the difference between a decent night's sleep and waking up more tired than when you went to bed. The rotation system they developed was pure genius. Since the person on the outside of the arrangement naturally got colder, they'd switch positions every few hours. It was like a freezing, critical version of musical chairs. Some units developed elaborate schedules, with soldiers taking turns being the outside man and the inside man. Others just switched when whoever was getting colder couldn't stand it anymore. They also figured out the art of the heat exchange. Before settling in for the night, soldiers would do what they called warming exercises, essentially vigorous calisthenics designed to get their blood pumping and their core temperature up. Then they'd quickly get into their shared sleeping arrangements while their bodies still had heat to share. It was like preheating an oven, except the oven was your buddy, and the oven was trying to keep you both alive. The buddy system extended beyond sleeping arrangements. During the day, soldiers would work in pairs to check each other for signs of hypothermia or frostbite. They transformed into amateur medical diagnosticians, adept at identifying the subtle indications that a person was losing their fight against the cold. Slurred speech, confusion, uncontrollable shivering, these weren't just symptoms. They were emergency signals that required immediate intervention. They developed communication systems that worked even when talking became difficult. They developed hand signals, predetermined phrases, and systems for checking in with each other at regular intervals. How are your fingers became as important a question as, what's our position? The answers could determine whether someone was still fully functional or needed immediate help. Some of the buddy system innovations were surprisingly sophisticated. Soldiers learned to share not just body heat, but also the heat generated by their equipment. A small camp stove or heating device could warm two people if they positioned themselves correctly and shared the heat efficiently. They'd create windbreaks for each other, taking turns blocking the wind while the other person warmed up. But perhaps most importantly, the buddy system provided psychological warmth. Being cold and miserable alone is one thing. Being cold and miserable with someone else somehow makes it bearable. They'd tell jokes, share stories, and complain together about the conditions. Misery loves company. And in this case, companionship could literally save your life. The trust required was enormous. You had to trust your buddy to wake you up if you showed signs of hypothermia during the night. You had to trust them to share resources fairly, tell you if you were developing frostbite, and help you make the countless small decisions that could mean survival or disaster. In return, you had to be trustworthy yourself, putting your buddy's survival on the same level as your own. If you've ever watched MacGyver and thought nobody could really make a heater out of a paperclip and a stick of gum, then you've never met a World War II soldier facing down a winter that could freeze the enthusiasm right out of an optimist. These guys became the original masters of making something from nothing, turning the phrase "work with what you've got" into a survival philosophy that would make modern survivalists take notes. The first lesson in battlefield heating was that everything, and I mean everything, was a potential heat source. Did you ever have an empty tin can for your lunch? Congratulations, you just found yourself a hand warmer. Those candles you've been saving for special occasions? Every night trying not to become a human ice cube counts as special. The alcohol you've been hoarding for when the war ends? Well, it turns out alcohol burns, and burning things make heat. Who knew? Soldiers became amateur chemists, learning which materials burned cleanest and longest. They discovered that strips of cardboard, when rolled tightly and lit, could burn for surprisingly long periods. Paper soaked in melted candle wax became a slow-burning fuel source. They learned to make buddy burners, tin cans filled with rolled cardboard and wax that could provide heat for hours. But the real innovation came in heat distribution and conservation. While creating fire was the initial step, the real challenge was directing that heat to its most beneficial location. Soldiers learned to create heat reflectors using polished metal, mirrors, or even pieces of glass. They'd position these reflectors to bounce heat from small fires back toward themselves, essentially doubling the effectiveness of their heat sources. They also mastered the art of the heat bank. A fire could heat large stones, metal objects, or even their mess kits, which they then used as portable heaters. A hot stone wrapped in cloth could keep hands warm for hours. A heated mess kit could be tucked into a sleeping bag to pre-warm it before bedtime. The group was essentially creating medieval hot water bottles, but without using actual water bottles. Some of the most creative solutions involved repurposing military equipment in ways that would probably violate several military regulations. Empty ammunition boxes became miniature stoves. Discarded helmets became heat reflectors, or even cooking surfaces. They could create structures for holding heat sources, or build makeshift heaters using rifle cleaning rods. The really clever ones figured out group heating systems that would make modern heating engineers jealous. They'd dig small pits in the ground, line them with stones, build fires in them until the stones were thoroughly heated, then cover the coals and use the heated stones as radiant heaters. The thermal mass of the stones would continue to give off heat long after the fire had died down. Body heat amplification became another specialty. They learned to create heat traps using whatever materials were available. They could arrange extra clothing to create air pockets that trapped body heat. Blankets could be rigged to create tent-like structures that concentrated warmth from multiple heat sources. They figured out how to use their breath as a heating system, creating small enclosed spaces where exhaled air could warm incoming cold air. Some soldiers became experts in what they called heat scavenging, finding ways to capture and use heat that was already being generated. If someone was cooking, they'd position themselves to catch the heat from the cooking fire. If equipment was running and generating heat, they'd find ways to benefit from that warmth. No BTU was allowed to escape without being put to good use. The innovation extended to personal heating devices that bordered on genius. Soldiers learned to make hand warmers using metal containers, chemical reactions, or even simple friction devices. They'd create heated insoles for their boots using materials that retained heat. Some figured out how to modify their clothing to create better heat retention, adding layers, creating air pockets, or even rigging up primitive heating systems within their uniforms. But perhaps the most impressive innovations were the ones that solved multiple problems at once. One could use a heat-generating device for cooking, drying damp clothes, melting snow for drinking water, or even for signalling purposes. They weren't just making heaters, they were creating multi-purpose survival tools that addressed several needs simultaneously. The knowledge sharing that happened around these innovations was remarkable. Successful heat-making techniques rapidly disseminated throughout the units. Soldiers would demonstrate their inventions to others, teach their techniques, and continuously improve on each other's designs. It was like an open-source hardware project, except the hardware was keeping people alive. What's truly amazing is how these field innovations often worked better than the official equipment. Standard-issue heating devices, when they existed at all, were often too heavy, too fuel-intensive, or too fragile for field conditions. The soldier-invented alternatives were lighter, more efficient, and built to withstand the kind of abuse that comes with being carried into combat zones. Now, if you think building a blanket fort in your living room makes you an architect, wait until you hear about the subterranean cities that soldiers created when the surface world became too hostile for human habitation. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were sophisticated underground living spaces that would make tiny modern house enthusiasts weep with envy. The inspiration for going underground was pretty straightforward. If the surface temperature was trying to kill you, maybe it was time to accept the Earth's invitation to come inside. Soldiers quickly learned that just a few feet below ground, temperatures were significantly warmer and much more stable. Discovering a natural thermostat that Mother Nature had been concealing was a profound revelation. But digging a hole and calling it home was just the beginning. These underground spaces evolved into complex engineering projects that required skills nobody taught in basic training. Soldiers became excavation experts, structural engineers, and interior designers all at once. They had to figure out ventilation systems that would provide fresh air without letting in deadly cold. They needed drainage systems to prevent their homes from becoming underground swimming pools, and they had to create heating systems that wouldn't asphyxiate them in their sleep. The basic foxhole quickly evolved into something that resembled a studio apartment designed by someone who really understood the importance of thermal efficiency. They'd start with a basic excavation, then line the walls with whatever materials were available. Logs, boards, corrugated metal, even a packed snow that would freeze into protective walls. The key was creating insulation between the living space and the surrounding earth. Ventilation was the tricky part. You needed fresh air to breathe, but every opening was a potential heat leak. Soldiers became experts in creating air circulation systems that brought in oxygen while maintaining temperature. They'd create baffled entrances that prevented cold air from flowing directly into the living space. Some developed sophisticated chimney systems that drew smoke out while pulling fresh air in through carefully designed vents. The heating systems they created for these underground spaces were marvels of efficiency. Small stoves made from tin cans or salvaged metal could heat an entire underground room. They learned to position heat sources for maximum efficiency and to create systems that distributed heat evenly throughout the space. Some even figured out radiant heating systems using heated stones or metal objects that would slowly release heat over time. But the real innovation was in space utilization. These weren't just survival shelters, they were livable spaces designed for multiple people to coexist in comfort. They created sleeping areas, common areas, storage spaces, and even workshops where they could maintain equipment or create new survival tools. Some underground spaces included multiple rooms connected by tunnels, essentially creating underground apartment complexes. The construction techniques they developed were surprisingly sophisticated. They learned to create structural supports that could handle the weight of Earth above while providing maximum living space below. They figured out how to waterproof their constructions using available materials. Some even created elevated floors to prevent ground moisture from making their living spaces damp and cold. Furniture in these underground hotels was a triumph of creative repurposing. Empty ammunition boxes became chairs, tables, and storage units. Logs or boards became benches and bed frames. Salvaged materials were transformed into shelving, lighting fixtures, and organisational systems. They were essentially furnished apartments created entirely from military surplus and found materials. The social dynamics of underground living required their own innovations. Multiple people living in small underground spaces needed systems for privacy, organisation, and conflict resolution. They developed schedules for sharing common areas, systems for maintaining cleanliness, and protocols for managing the inevitable personality conflicts that arise when you're essentially living in a cave with your co-workers. Some units created underground spaces that were genuinely impressive engineering projects. They'd excavate large common areas that could accommodate entire squads, with separate sleeping alcoves, storage areas, and workshop spaces. These underground complexes included sophisticated drainage systems, multiple heating zones, and even recreational areas where soldiers could relax when they weren't on duty. The decoration of these spaces reveals something touching about the human need for comfort and beauty, even in the most challenging circumstances. Soldiers would bring whatever personal items they could into these underground homes. Soldiers brought photographs, letters, and small mementos that served as reminders of their home. Some created artwork on the walls, carved decorations into wooden supports, or arranged their few possessions in ways that made the space feel more like home and less like a survival bunker. Perhaps most remarkably, these underground spaces became centres of community life. They were where soldiers shared meals, told stories, played games, and maintained the social connections that were crucial for morale. They weren't just surviving in these spaces, they were living, creating small communities that provided warmth, not just for bodies, but for spirits. You might think that eating in sub-zero temperatures is just a matter of opening a can and hoping for the best. But soldiers in World War II's coldest theatres discovered that food wasn't just fuel, it was medicine, a hand warmer, a morale booster, and occasionally the difference between making it through the night and not making it at all. The science of eating to stay warm became as crucial as any military strategy. The first thing these soldiers learned was that their bodies became calorie-burning furnaces in cold weather. Your body exerts significant effort to sustain its core temperature, consuming fuel at a pace that rivals that of a high-performance sports car. A soldier in freezing conditions might burn 4,000 to 6,000 calories a day, about twice what you'd burn sitting at a desk job. But here's the catch. Military rations weren't designed for Arctic conditions, and supply lines in wartime were about as reliable as weather forecasts. So soldiers became nutritional strategists, learning to maximize the warming potential of every morsel of food. They discovered that different types of food generated different amounts of internal heat. Fats and proteins were like throwing logs on your internal fire. They burned slowly and steadily, providing long-lasting warmth. Carbohydrates were more like kindling quick energy that could help when you needed an immediate heat boost. Hot food became medicine. A warm meal didn't just fill your stomach. It raised your core body temperature, improved circulation, and provided psychological comfort that was almost as important as the physical warmth. Soldiers would go to extraordinary lengths to heat their food, creating elaborate cooking systems that could function in the worst conditions. They became masters of what modern campers call one-pot meals, but their versions were far more sophisticated. They learned to create stews and soups that could be cooked efficiently, while providing maximum nutritional and thermal benefit. These weren't just random ingredients thrown together, they were carefully planned combinations designed to provide sustained energy and warmth. Some of the food heating innovations were pure genius. Soldiers learned to use heated stones to warm their food, essentially creating prehistoric slow cookers. They'd heat metal objects in fires and use them to warm pre-cooked food. Some figured out how to use the heat from their bodies to slowly warm food over time, essentially wearing their dinner until it was ready to eat. The timing of eating became crucial. A hot meal right before sleep could provide the calories needed to maintain body temperature through the night. Small snacks throughout the day could keep the internal fires burning steadily. They learned to eat strategically, timing their food intake to provide maximum warming benefit when they needed it most. But here's where it gets really interesting. Soldiers discovered that some foods were natural hand warmers. Soldiers could hold hard candies, chocolate, nuts, and other high-energy foods in their mouths or hands to provide both nutrition and localized warmth. A piece of chocolate wasn't just a treat, it was a portable heating element that happened to taste delicious. They also became experts in food preservation in extreme cold. While freezing temperatures created storage challenges, they also provided natural refrigeration that could keep food fresh longer than normal. Soldiers learned to use the cold as a tool, freezing water for later use, preserving food that might otherwise spoil, and even creating makeshift ice boxes for storing supplies. The social aspect of eating in extreme cold conditions was equally important. Sharing hot food became a bonding experience that strengthened unit cohesion. Soldiers would alternate in cooking, exchange recipes and techniques, and ensure equitable distribution of the available hot food. A warm meal shared with comrades provided psychological warmth that was almost as important as the physical calories. Some units developed sophisticated cooking schedules that ensured someone always had access to hot food. They'd stagger their mealtime so that cooking fires were kept going. Throughout the day, this process essentially created a continuous source of heat and warm food. This process wasn't just about nutrition, it was about maintaining a constant source of warmth and comfort. The creativity in food preparation was remarkable. Soldiers learned to make hot drinks from almost anything. Melted snow mixed with whatever flavourings they could find, hot water with dissolved hard candies, even warm broths made from reconstituted rations. These weren't gourmet beverages, but they provided internal warmth and psychological comfort. They also discovered the warming power of spicy foods. They valued anything that could provide them with internal warmth. They treasured anything that could generate an internal heat sensation, including hot peppers, spicy sauces, and even strong alcohol. Some soldiers would save their spiciest rations for the coldest nights, using them as both food and internal heating systems. The most touching aspect of food in these extreme conditions was how it connected soldiers to home. Letters from family often included recipes, suggestions for staying warm, or descriptions of warm meals being prepared back home. Food served as a conduit between the frigid battlefield and the cosy kitchens they recalled, offering a level of comfort that extended beyond mere sustenance. After months of treating every degree above freezing like a personal gift from the weather gods, you might think that the arrival of spring would have been pure celebration. But for soldiers who had spent months becoming master craftsmen of survival, spring brought its own unique challenges, and revealed just how profoundly the experience of extreme cold had changed them. The first warm day was like meeting an old friend you hadn't seen in years. Soldiers would actually stand outside, faces turned toward the sun, trying to remember what warmth felt like on their skin. Some described it as almost overwhelming. After months of associating heat with precious, carefully rationed resources, having unlimited warmth from the sky felt like winning the lottery. But spring also meant saying goodbye to the elaborate survival systems they'd created. Was it time to abandon the carefully engineered underground shelters that had served as homes for months? Time to abandon them. Other sophisticated heating systems, which were crafted from scraps and ingenuity, no longer necessary. They are no longer necessary. We can now pack away the carefully planned clothing systems that had kept the survivors alive through the darkest nights. It was time to pack them away. There was something almost melancholy about dismantling these survival innovations. These weren't just tools, they were the products of creativity, desperation and collaboration that had literally saved lives. Some soldiers kept their homemade heating devices or modified clothing as souvenirs, tangible reminders of what they'd accomplished when everything seemed impossible. The transition to spring weather required its adjustments. Bodies that had adapted to burning massive amounts of calories to stay warm suddenly didn't need that fuel. Circulation systems that had been working overtime to keep extremities functional needed time to readjust. Some soldiers actually felt cold in temperatures that would have seemed tropical during the worst of winter. More importantly, spring revealed the psychological impact of surviving extreme conditions. These soldiers had developed a different relationship with comfort, with warmth, with the simple pleasure of not being cold. Many described never again taking for granted things like warm buildings, hot meals, or simply being able to feel their fingers and toes. The knowledge they'd gained didn't disappear with the snow. Veterans of extreme cold conditions became valuable resources for training new soldiers, passing on the hard-won wisdom of survival in impossible conditions. They taught the sock rotation systems, the buddy heating techniques, the underground construction methods, and the crucial psychology of staying warm when your equipment fails. Some of the innovations that soldiers developed in desperation actually influenced post-war military equipment design. The military started focusing more on cold weather gear, leveraging the hands-on experience of soldiers who had discovered effective solutions when lives were at stake. The gap between what looked good on paper and what functioned in life or death situations had been dramatically revealed. But perhaps most importantly, These experiences created bonds between soldiers that lasted long after the war ended. Men who had shared body heat to survive, who had worked together to build underground shelters, who had created heating systems from scraps. These shared experiences created relationships that transcended normal military camaraderie. Years later, at unit reunions, veterans would still discuss the innovations they'd created, the close calls they'd survived, and the remarkable things they'd accomplished when circumstances forced them to become inventors, engineers, and survival experts. They'd demonstrate their old sock-changing techniques, laugh about the complex methods for sharing body heat, and marvel at their ingenuity. The story of how World War II soldiers survived the coldest nights isn't just about individual survival. It's about what humans can accomplish when they combine necessity with creativity, when they work together toward a common goal, and when they refuse to let impossible conditions defeat them. Every warm sock, every shared sleeping bag, every makeshift heater was a small victory against circumstances that seemed designed to be unbeatable. These soldiers proved that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about adapting, innovating, and maintaining humanity even in the most inhumane conditions. They showed that comfort isn't just about having the right equipment, but about the creativity to make something from nothing, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the best heating system is another human being who is facing the same challenges you are. So the next time you're adjusting your thermostat, pulling up an extra blanket, or complaining about being a little chilly, remember the soldiers who turned survival into an art form, who made warmth from scraps and ingenuity, and who proved that the human capacity for adaptation and innovation knows no limits, even when the thermometer suggests otherwise. Ultimately, they not only endured the coldest nights, but also conquered them through inventive solutions, and in doing so they left us a legacy not just of military history, but of human resilience, creativity, and the remarkable things that become possible when ordinary people refuse to accept that extraordinary circumstances must defeat them.